The revolver's hammer clicked back in the frozen silence. Evelyn Mercer stood between her dying husband's ranch and 5 armed men, her fingers steady on the trigger. Behind her, cattle collapsed in convulsions, victims of a plague no one understood. In front of her, Montana's most ruthless cattle baron smiled like a wolf circling wounded prey. This is the story of how a mail-order bride with a deadly secret and a desperate rancher fought corruption, disease, and an entire valley that wanted them destroyed. Stay until the end, hit that like button, and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. The stagecoach lurched through the blizzard like a dying animal, its wheels carving deep scars into Montana's snow that hadn't stopped falling for 6 weeks. Inside, Evelyn Mercer pressed her gloved hand against the frosted window and watched the Bitterroot Mountains rise like broken teeth against a sky the color of old bruises. She was 31 years old, traveling under a false name and carrying enough secrets to get herself killed. The other passenger, a whiskey drummer from Butte, had given up trying to make conversation an hour ago. He sat across from her now, snoring with his mouth open, oblivious to the fact that the woman sharing his coach had burned her entire life to the ground 3 months earlier and was now riding toward a man she'd never met, on a ranch she'd chosen specifically because it was already dying. Evelyn shifted her weight, feeling the heavy medical bag press against her hip beneath her traveling cloak. Inside that bag were instruments no proper lady should own, chemicals that could kill a man in minutes, and research journals that represented 7 years of work the scientific establishment had declared worthless simply because she'd been born female. Her father's work, actually, but he was dead now, and the patent had died with him. The stagecoach hit a rut hard enough to wake the drummer. He blinked, wiped drool from his chin, and squinted at Evelyn like he was seeing her for the first time. "We're close to Iron Hollow," he said, his voice rough from sleep and cheap liquor. "You sure about this, ma'am? Coulter Hayes ain't exactly living in paradise out there." Evelyn didn't answer immediately. She'd learned that silence made men uncomfortable, and uncomfortable men talked too much. "I heard his cattle been dropping dead for 2 months straight," the drummer continued, unable to help himself. "Some kind of blood fever. Turns their insides to mush. Whole valley thinks the land's cursed. Been saying so since his wife died birthing their stillborn son 5 years back." "I don't believe in curses," Evelyn said quietly. "Well, the bank believes in foreclosure." The drummer laughed at his own joke. "Victor Crowley's been waiting to snap up that property soon as Hayes goes under. Crowley owns half the territory already, and he don't like competition, even dying competition." Evelyn filed that information away. She'd heard Crowley's name before, back east. The kind of man who built empires by crushing anyone too weak to fight back. Perfect. The stagecoach crested a ridge, and through the swirling snow Evelyn caught her first glimpse of Iron Hollow Ranch. It sat in a narrow valley surrounded by pine forests so thick they looked black against the white landscape. The main house was a low, rough-cut timber structure with smoke rising from a stone chimney. The barn and corrals sprawled out behind it, and even from this distance, Evelyn could see dark shapes scattered across the snow. Dead cattle. The drummer whistled low. "Jesus, that's worse than I heard." Evelyn said nothing. She was counting the carcasses, estimating herd size, calculating how much time she had before the entire operation collapsed. 6 weeks? Maybe 8 if Hayes had been conservative with his losses. Not much margin for error. The stagecoach rolled to a stop in front of the ranch house, and Evelyn stepped down into snow that came up to her ankles. The cold hit her like a physical blow. Nothing like the winters back in Philadelphia, where buildings blocked the wind and civilization kept the wilderness at bay. Out here, the cold wanted you dead. It didn't care about your plans or your pride or your desperate need to prove everyone wrong. The ranch house door opened. The man who emerged wasn't what Evelyn expected. Coulter Hayes was tall and built like someone who'd spent his entire life fighting the land for survival. His face was weathered to leather, with deep lines around his eyes, and a mouth that looked like it had forgotten how to smile. He wore a wool coat patched at the elbows, work boots caked with frozen mud, and a look of profound exhaustion that went deeper than simple fatigue. This was a man who'd been losing for so long he'd stopped believing he could win. Their eyes met across the snow, and for a moment, neither spoke. Evelyn could see him trying to reconcile the woman in front of him with whatever fantasy he'd constructed from her letters. She'd been deliberately vague in her correspondence, never quite lying but never telling the whole truth either. Miss Mercer? His voice was rough, cautious. Mr. Hayes? Evelyn kept her tone neutral, professional. Thank you for meeting me. Didn't have much choice, seeing as you're here. He moved toward the coach, and Evelyn noticed the slight hitch in his left leg. Old injury, badly healed. Let me get your trunk. I have 3, Evelyn said. Coulter paused, one hand already on the luggage rack. 3 trunks for a ranch wedding? I believe in being prepared. The drummer was already unloading her belongings, eager to finish this run and get back to civilization. The first trunk was heavy enough to make Coulter grunt with effort. The second was even worse. Packed tight with books and equipment Evelyn had smuggled out of Philadelphia piece by piece. The third trunk was locked with a padlock Evelyn kept the key to on a chain around her neck. When Coulter tried to lift it, something inside shifted with a metallic rattle. What the hell you got in here? He asked. Rocks? Scientific instruments, Evelyn said calmly, and chemicals that would kill you if they broke, so please be careful. Coulter set the trunk down harder than necessary and stared at her. You want to explain that? Not particularly. Evelyn turned to the drummer, who was already climbing back onto the coach, clearly wanting no part of whatever domestic drama was about to unfold. Thank you for the pleasant journey. The drummer tipped his hat without looking at her, and the stagecoach pulled away, leaving Evelyn and Coulter alone in the frozen yard with 3 mysterious trunks and a silence thick enough to choke on. Finally, Coulter spoke. You're not what I expected. Good, Evelyn said. Expectations are generally disappointing. Your letters said you were looking for a new start. Companionship. A quiet life on a ranch. His eyes narrowed. They didn't say nothing about chemicals or scientific instruments or 3 trunks full of God knows what. Evelyn met his gaze without flinching. Your advertisement said you wanted a wife. It didn't specify that she needed to be stupid. Something flickered across Coulter's face. Surprise, maybe? Or the ghost of humor. It disappeared almost immediately, buried under layers of suspicion and exhaustion. We should get inside, he said finally. Storm's getting worse. He was right. The wind had picked up, driving snow horizontally across the valley. Evelyn grabbed her medical bag while Coulter hauled the trunks one by one toward the house, his breath coming out in frozen clouds. The interior of the ranch house was sparse but clean, rough-hewn furniture, a stone fireplace crackling with pine logs, oil lamps casting yellow light across walls decorated with nothing but functional items. No photographs, no personal touches, no evidence that anyone actually lived here instead of just surviving. Coulter set the last trunk down near the bedroom door and turned to face her, arms crossed. Before this goes any further, he said, you need to know what you're walking into. Evelyn removed her traveling cloak and hung it on a peg near the door. I'm listening. The ranch is dying, has been for 2 months. I've lost 40% of my herd to some kind of disease the veterinarians can't explain. The bank's threatening foreclosure. I got enemies in the valley who'd be real happy to see me fail. He paused, jaw tight. And I got no money to pay you passage back east if you decide this was a mistake. Are you trying to scare me away, Mr. Hayes? I'm trying to be honest. Coulter's voice was rough. You came all this way expecting a working ranch and a man who could provide for you. What you got instead is a dying operation, and a man 1 bad month away from losing everything his family built. Evelyn studied him carefully. She'd read desperation in men before, the way it made them either cruel or reckless. But Coulter Hayes looked like someone who'd been fighting so hard for so long that he'd forgotten why he started. May I see the infected cattle? She asked. Coulter blinked. What? The diseased animals. I'd like to examine them. Why the hell would you want to do that? Because, Evelyn said calmly, if I'm going to live here, I should understand what's killing your livelihood. For a long moment, Coulter just stared at her like she'd started speaking a foreign language. Then, slowly, he nodded. Get your warmest coat, he said. It's brutal out there. Heck. The wind cut through Evelyn's clothing like frozen knives as they trudged through knee-deep snow toward the nearest corral. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the valley in shades of purple and gray that made the scattered carcasses look like dark islands in a white sea. Coulter led her to a barn that smelled of hay, manure, and something else. Something wrong. Inside, a single cow lay in a bed of straw, its breathing labored and wet. Even in the dim light, Evelyn could see the animal was dying. This one's been sick for 3 days, Coulter said quietly. By tomorrow morning, she'll be dead like the others. Evelyn knelt beside the cow, ignoring the straw and filth soaking into her skirt. She pulled a small oil lamp from the nearby shelf and held it close to the animal's hide. There. Tiny dark spots clustered along the cow's neck and shoulders, barely visible against the brown coat, but unmistakable once you knew what to look for. Ticks, Evelyn murmured. What? Evelyn looked up at Coulter, her mind already racing through possibilities and probabilities. Your cattle aren't cursed, Mr. Hayes. They're infested with parasitic ticks carrying a blood pathogen. Coulter's expression went flat. Ticks don't kill cattle. These ones do. Evelyn stood, brushing straw from her skirt. The parasites they carry attack red blood cells, causing fever, anemia, and eventually organ failure. It's called babesiosis in scientific literature, though most ranchers just call it Texas fever or cattle tick fever. Never heard of it. Most people haven't. The research is new, and the scientific establishment doesn't particularly care about livestock diseases affecting Western ranches. Evelyn's voice carried an edge of bitterness. They're too busy publishing papers about subjects they think are more prestigious. Coulter was watching her now, with an expression somewhere between confusion and suspicion. How does a mail-order bride know about parasitic ticks and blood pathogens? This was the moment Evelyn had been preparing for since she'd first read Coulter's advertisement in the Philadelphia newspaper. The moment where she either gained his trust or lost everything. Because I'm not just a mail-order bride, Mr. Hayes. She met his eyes directly. My father was Dr. Jonathan Mercer, one of the leading researchers in veterinary pathology before he died. I was his research assistant for 7 years. I know more about livestock diseases than most of the veterinarians you've probably consulted, and I've developed treatments that could save your herd, if you're willing to let me try. The silence in the barn was absolute except for the dying cow's labored breathing. You lied to me, Coulter said finally. I omitted certain details, Evelyn corrected. Your advertisement said you wanted a wife. It didn't say she needed to be helpless. Why? Coulter's voice was hard now, angry. Why come all the way out here pretending to be something you're not? What the hell are you really after? Evelyn had known this question would come. She'd rehearsed her answer 100 times during the long journey west. But standing in this freezing barn with this exhausted, suspicious man, all her careful explanations felt hollow. So she told him the truth. Because after my father died, the cattle barons back east destroyed his reputation to steal his research. They couldn't accept that a woman had contributed to his work, so they declared all of it worthless and drove me out of Philadelphia. I lost my home, my position, my father's legacy, everything. Her voice stayed level, but something cold and sharp crept into it. So, yes, Mr. Hayes, I used your advertisement. I chose your ranch specifically because it was already dying, because I needed a place desperate enough to let me prove my cure works. Coulter's jaw tightened. You used me. Yes. You came out here planning to experiment on my cattle like they're nothing but laboratory animals. I came here planning to save them, Evelyn said, which is more than anyone else has offered to do. The dying cow let out a wet, rattling breath. Both of them looked at it, then back at each other. You should leave, Coulter said quietly. First stage out of here, you should go back east where you belong. And let your ranch die? Evelyn challenged. Let Victor Crowley take everything your family built? Let this disease spread to other herds across the valley because no one had the courage to fight it? That's not your problem. You're right. It's not. Evelyn turned toward the barn door, then paused. But I'm here now, and I have the knowledge and the treatment that could save your cattle. You can send me away because your pride is hurt that I wasn't completely honest in my letters. Or you can let me try to save what's left of your herd before the bank forecloses and Crowley wins everything. She walked to the door, one hand on the rough wood, waiting. Behind her, she heard Coulter exhale, a long, defeated sound. 3 days, he said. You got 3 days to show me this treatment of yours works. After that, if my cattle are still dying, you're on the first stage out of here. Evelyn turned back to face him. Agreed. And one more thing. Coulter's eyes were hard. We're not getting married. Not until I know who the hell you really are and what you're really doing here. That's fair, Evelyn said. They stood there in the dying light, two people who'd both lied to each other, surrounded by death and cold, and the wreckage of their separate desperations. It wasn't how Evelyn had imagined starting this partnership, but it would have to do. That night, Evelyn transformed the ranch house kitchen into something resembling her father's laboratory back in Philadelphia. She unpacked her trunks methodically, laying out glass vials, surgical instruments, notebooks filled with chemical formulas and treatment protocols. Coulter watched from the doorway, arms crossed, saying nothing. The treatment is complex, Evelyn explained as she worked, partly because he deserved to know, partly because talking helped her think. It requires a specific combination of sulfur compounds, arsenic derivatives, and cottonseed oil in precise ratios. Too little, and it won't kill the parasites. Too much, and it kills the animal. You're talking about poisoning my cattle to cure them. I'm talking about using controlled toxicity to eliminate an invasive organism without destroying the host. Evelyn measured powder into a glass beaker with steady hands. It's the same principle doctors use when they give patients mercury for syphilis, only my formula is significantly more effective and less likely to cause permanent damage. You've tested this before? On rats. And one dog that was already dying. Evelyn looked up at him. I won't lie to you about the risks, Mr. Hayes. This is experimental. It might not work, but doing nothing guarantees your herd dies anyway. Coulter was quiet for a long moment. Then, that cow in the barn, the sick one. Start with her. She's too far gone. The treatment works best in early-stage infection. Then we'll know if your cure can save animals that are already dying, won't we? It was a test, Evelyn realized. He was giving her the hardest possible case deliberately, either to prove her wrong or to see if she'd back down when challenged. Fine, she said, but I'll need your help. This isn't a one-person job. They worked through the night. Evelyn mixed her compounds by lamplight, while Coulter built a makeshift restraint system in the barn using rope and timber. The chemistry was delicate, requiring exact measurements and careful heating over the kitchen stove. One mistake could create toxic fumes or render the entire batch useless. Evelyn's hands didn't shake. By 3 a.m, they had 5 gallons of treatment solution and a plan that was probably going to get them both killed. The cow was worse when they returned to the barn, barely conscious, its breathing shallow and irregular. Coulter managed to get a halter on it and secured the animal's head while Evelyn prepared the injection. This is going to hurt her, Evelyn warned. The compounds burn going in and she'll probably thrash. Just do it. Evelyn filled a large syringe with the pale yellow solution and approached the cow carefully. She found the vein in the animal's neck by feel, pressed the needle through thick hide, and depressed the plunger slowly. The cow's eyes rolled white, its entire body convulsed, nearly breaking free of Coulter's grip. Hold her! Evelyn shouted. Coulter threw his full weight against the animal, using his body to pin it against the barn wall while Evelyn finished the injection. The cow screamed, a sound Evelyn had never heard cattle make before, high and desperate and full of pain. Then it went still. Evelyn pulled the needle free, breathing hard. Blood trickled from the injection site, darker than it should be, almost black in the lamplight. Is she dead? Coulter asked. No. Unconscious. The shock put her into a kind of hibernation state. Evelyn wiped sweat from her forehead despite the freezing temperature. Now we wait. They sat in the straw on opposite sides of the barn, watching the cow's chest rise and fall in shallow breaths. The oil lamp burned low. Outside, the wind screamed across the valley like something alive and hungry. You said cattle barons destroyed your father's reputation, Coulter said after a long silence. What'd they do? Evelyn didn't answer immediately. She'd spent 3 months trying not to think about Philadelphia, about the hearing, about watching her father's life's work dismissed as fraud by men who'd never spent a single day conducting actual research. But sitting here in this freezing barn, waiting to see if her cure would work or fail spectacularly, the words came anyway. My father developed a treatment for rinderpest, a viral disease that was decimating imported European cattle. He proved it worked in controlled trials, but when he tried to publish his research, the established veterinarians accused him of fabricating data. They said a small-town doctor couldn't possibly have succeeded where university researchers had failed. She paused. What they really meant was that they couldn't accept that a man who let his daughter assist him, who taught her chemistry and biology and surgical techniques instead of needlework and piano, could produce legitimate science. So they called him a fraud. They called him worse than that. They said he was a dangerous charlatan, putting livestock and human consumers at risk. They pressured journals to reject his papers. They convinced the patent office to deny his applications. Evelyn's voice stayed flat, clinical. And when he died of heart failure 6 months later, they made sure everyone knew it was because he couldn't handle the shame of being exposed. But his research was real. Every word of it. Evelyn looked at the dying cow. Which is why I'm here. Because if I can save your herd using treatments developed from his work, I can prove they were wrong. I can clear his name and reclaim what they stole from us. Coulter was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. You know there's a good chance this don't work. That cow might be dead by morning, and my whole herd right behind her. I know. And even if it does work, you're gambling everything on a dying ranch in the middle of Montana that might get foreclosed before you can prove anything. I know that too. Then you're either the bravest person I've ever met, Coulter said, or the most foolish. Evelyn smiled without humor. Those aren't mutually exclusive. Dawn came slowly, pale light creeping through gaps in the barn walls. The wind had finally died down, leaving an eerie silence broken only by the sound of their breathing and the cow's slow, labored heartbeat. Evelyn stood stiffly, joints protesting from hours of sitting in the cold. She approached the cow carefully, hand extended toward its neck to check for fever. The cow's eyes opened. Evelyn froze. The animal lifted its head slowly, not with the jerky, pained movements of a dying creature, but with something resembling normal awareness. Its breathing had deepened, regularized. The black spots along its hide looked less swollen, less angry. Jesus Christ, Coulter whispered. Evelyn pressed her hand against the cow's neck, feeling for temperature and pulse. Both were still elevated, but significantly better than 12 hours ago. She examined the injection site, checked the animal's gums, listened to its heartbeat through the stethoscope she'd retrieved from her medical bag. Then she stepped back and met Coulter's eyes. It's working, she said quietly. It's actually working. For the first time since Evelyn had arrived at Iron Hollow Ranch, Coulter Hayes smiled. Not a big smile, not even a particularly hopeful one, but genuine nonetheless. Well, I'll be damned, he said. They stood there in the barn as morning light turned the snow outside from gray to white to gold, watching a cow that should have been dead instead struggle to its feet and look around like it was surprised to find itself still alive. Neither of them said what they were both thinking, that this was just one animal, that they had an entire herd to save, that Victor Crowley and the bank and the whole valley that wanted them to fail were still out there waiting. But for this one moment, in this freezing barn that smelled of hay and manure and desperate hope, they'd won something, and that would have to be enough to keep fighting. The next 72 hours tested Evelyn and Coulter in ways neither had anticipated. Word spread fast in the valley. By noon, neighboring ranchers started showing up at Iron Hollow's boundary fence, not to help, but to watch, to see if the crazy woman who claimed she could cure blood fever was actually telling the truth, or if Coulter Hayes was about to lose everything in spectacular fashion. Evelyn ignored them. She had work to do. They started with the early-stage cases, cattle that showed symptoms but weren't yet critical. Evelyn prepared batch after batch of treatment solution, while Coulter and 2 hired hands he couldn't really afford rounded up infected animals and brought them to a makeshift processing station they'd set up near the barn. The work was brutal. Each injection required perfect timing and technique. Too fast, and the compounds would cause fatal shock. Too slow, and the parasites would continue multiplying faster than the treatment could kill them. Evelyn's hands cramped from holding syringes. Her back screamed from bending over cattle. Her eyes burned from lack of sleep and chemical fumes. She didn't stop. Coulter watched her with something like awe. This woman who'd arrived in fancy traveling clothes now worked in a blood-stained apron, hair tied back with twine, hands steady despite exhaustion. She moved between animals with confidence born from years of training no one had acknowledged, making life or death decisions without hesitation. "You're better at this than the last 3 veterinarians I hired," he said on the second day, holding a young steer still while Evelyn administered treatment. "That's because they learned from books written by men who've never actually treated a sick animal," Evelyn replied without looking up. "My father taught me that real medicine happens in barns and fields, not university lecture halls." "Your father sounds like he was a smart man." "He was." Evelyn pulled the needle free and marked the steer's ear with a daub of paint to indicate it had been treated. He was also stubborn, idealistic, and completely blind to how the world actually works. He thought good research would speak for itself, that truth would win out over politics and prejudice. You don't believe that? I believe truth needs someone willing to fight for it. Evelyn moved to the next animal. Otherwise, it just gets buried by people with more power and less conscience. On the third day, Victor Crowley came to visit. He arrived in a black carriage pulled by 4 matched horses, accompanied by 2 men who wore their guns where everyone could see them. Crowley himself was a big man gone soft around the middle, dressed in an expensive suit completely impractical for ranch country. He had the kind of face that looked friendly until you noticed his eyes, cold and calculating, measuring everything in terms of profit and loss. Coulter met him at the property line, rifle held casually across his chest. "Crowley," he said flatly, "you're trespassing." "Just came to check on my future property," Crowley said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Heard you hired yourself some kind of miracle worker. Wanted to see if the rumors were true." "My ranch isn't your property." "Not yet. But the bank says you got less than a week to make your loan payment, and from what I hear, you've been too busy playing doctor to sell any cattle." Crowley's gaze shifted past Coulter to where Evelyn was working near the barn. "That her? The mail-order bride who thinks she can cure blood fever with chemicals and witchcraft?" "That's Dr. Mercer," Coulter said, his voice dropping into something dangerous. "And she's doing more to save this ranch than you ever did for the valley." Crowley laughed. "Doctor? Hayes, you got yourself swindled by a woman playing pretend. There's no cure for blood fever. Every real veterinarian knows that. Disease comes, disease goes. All you can do is cull the infected animals and hope it don't spread." Or, Evelyn's voice cut across the yard sharp and clear, you could actually treat the underlying parasitic infection instead of giving up like a coward. She'd approached without either man noticing, still wearing her blood-stained apron, hair coming loose from its tie, looking nothing like the refined lady Crowley probably expected, but her eyes were steady and hard. Crowley's smile widened. "You got yourself a spirited one, Hayes. Shame she's wasting her fire on a lost cause." "The only lost cause here is your attempt at intimidation," Evelyn said. "Mr. Hayes's herd is recovering. We've treated 47 animals in the past 3 days, and the survival rate is currently 92%. Those are numbers no amount of your posturing can change." Something shifted in Crowley's expression. Surprise, quickly covered by anger. "You want to be careful, lady," one of Crowley's men said. "Mr. Crowley don't appreciate being talked to like that." Evelyn didn't even look at him. She kept her eyes on Crowley. "And I don't appreciate cattle barons who profit from other people's suffering. So I suppose we're even." For a long moment, nobody moved. The tension stretched tight enough to snap. Then Crowley laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You know what? I like you," he said to Evelyn. "You got more balls than most men I know. It's going to be a real shame when this whole operation falls apart and you're stuck married to a broke rancher with nothing but debt and dead dreams." He climbed back into his carriage, his men following. Before leaving, he leaned out the window one more time. "1 week, Hayes," he said. "Then the bank takes this place, and I take it from them. All your fighting won't change that." The carriage rolled away, leaving deep ruts in the muddy road. Coulter turned to Evelyn. "You shouldn't have antagonized him like that." "Why not?" "He's a bully and a coward. Someone needed to say it. Because now he knows you're the real threat, which means he's going to come after you specifically." Coulter's expression was grim. Men like Crowley don't forget when someone makes them look foolish, especially not in front of their hired guns. Then he'll learn I'm not as easy to crush as he thinks. Evelyn turned back toward the barn. "Now come on. We've got 20 more cattle to treat before dark, and I'm not letting Victor Crowley's wounded pride slow us down." Coulter watched her walk away, this strange, brilliant, infuriating woman who'd lied her way onto his ranch and was now fighting for it harder than he'd fought for anything in years. He didn't know whether to thank her or warn her to run. Probably both. Esicht. By the end of the week, the impossible had happened. The treated cattle weren't just surviving, they were recovering. Animals that had been hours from death were now standing, eating, showing interest in their surroundings. The ones treated early were almost completely healthy, ready to rejoin the main herd. Evelyn had done it. She'd proven her father's research worked. But the victory came with a price. On the morning Coulter needed his bank payment, Evelyn discovered something that changed everything. She'd been checking the cattle near the ranch's natural spring, a warm water source that kept one section of the property from freezing solid even in deep winter. The infected animals had clustered near the spring initially, which Evelyn had attributed to sick cattle seeking warmth. Now she realized that wasn't the whole story. Beneath the snow, half buried in mud at the spring's edge, she found rotting cattle hides. Dozens of them, deliberately placed, crawling with the same parasitic ticks that had infected Coulter's herd. Someone had seeded the infection intentionally. Evelyn pulled on heavy gloves and examined the hides more closely. Most were too decomposed to reveal much, but one, newer than the others, still had a brand mark visible on what remained of the hide. A brand she recognized from Crowley's carriage horses. Her hands started shaking, and it had nothing to do with the cold. This wasn't bad luck or natural disease spread. This was deliberate sabotage. Someone had collected infected hides from Crowley's own cattle, animals that must have died from the same blood fever months ago, and planted them at Iron Hollow specifically to destroy Coulter's herd, which meant Crowley had known about the disease, had probably been dealing with it in his own operations, and instead of warning neighboring ranchers or seeking treatment, he'd weaponized it to eliminate competition. Evelyn stood in the snow, staring at the evidence, feeling cold rage settle into her chest like ice water. This was exactly like Philadelphia. Exactly like the cattle barons who'd destroyed her father's work. Men with power and money who saw innovation as a threat instead of progress, who'd rather crush competition than compete fairly. Men who needed to be stopped. She gathered samples of the infected hides, documented their location, and photographed the brand marks using the camera equipment she'd brought in her third trunk. Then she went to find Coulter. He was in the barn, preparing to ride into town with what little money he'd managed to scrape together. Not enough to cover the full loan payment, but hopefully enough to buy more time. "We need to talk," Evelyn said. Coulter looked up, saw her expression, and set down the ledger book he'd been reviewing. "What's wrong?" Evelyn told him everything. About the hides, the brands, the deliberate nature of the infection. She watched his face go from confusion to disbelief to a cold, murderous rage that reminded her he was a man who'd survived on the Montana frontier for 35 years, not some gentleman playing at ranching. "I'm going to kill him," Coulter said quietly. "No, you're not." "The hell I'm not. He tried to destroy my ranch, killed my cattle, tried to ruin me. And if you ride into town and put a bullet in Victor Crowley, you'll hang for murder, and he'll win anyway." Evelyn grabbed his arm, forcing him to look at her. "Listen to me. We have evidence. Physical proof that he spread this disease intentionally. That's interstate commerce violation, moving infected materials across territorial lines with intent to cause harm. The federal authorities will actually care about that." "You think I give a damn about federal authorities? He tried to take everything from me." "So we take everything from him instead." Evelyn's voice was steel. "We expose what he did. We show the entire valley that their cattle baron hero is actually a criminal who endangered every herd in Montana just to eliminate one competitor. We destroy his reputation the same way he tried to destroy yours." Coulter stared at her for a long moment. Then slowly, the rage in his expression shifted into something colder and more calculated. "You've got a plan," he said. "I've got a plan." Evelyn released his arm. "But it requires you to trust me, and it requires you to not shoot Victor Crowley on sight when he shows up to foreclose on your ranch." "He's coming here?" "Of course he is. He'll want to watch you fail in person." Evelyn smiled without humor, which is exactly what we need him to do. Outside, the sun was setting behind the Bitterroot Mountains, painting the snow in shades of orange and red that looked like fire spreading across the frozen valley. Inside the barn, two people who'd started as strangers bound by desperation and lies began planning how to burn down a cattle empire, and neither of them was smiling anymore. The plan Evelyn laid out that night was either brilliant or completely insane, and Coulter couldn't decide which until she'd finished talking. They sat at the kitchen table with the infected cattle hides spread across newspaper, the stench of rot filling the small room despite the cold. Evelyn had her research journals open, pages covered in chemical formulas and legal statutes she'd copied from law books back in Philadelphia. "Crowley's going to come here with the sheriff and bank officials to execute the foreclosure," Evelyn said, her finger tracing lines in her notebook. "That's his pattern. He likes making a public spectacle of taking people's property, make sure everyone in the valley knows what happens when you cross him. So we let him come, Coulter said slowly. And then what? Then I present evidence that he deliberately spread an infectious disease across territorial lines with intent to cause economic harm. Evelyn looked up, her eyes sharp in the lamplight. That's not just sabotage, Coulter. That's bioterrorism. That's a federal crime that carries prison time even for men as connected as Victor Crowley. Coulter picked up one of the rotting hides, examining the brand mark that matched Crowley's operation. You really think the sheriff's going to arrest the richest man in Montana based on some decomposed cowhide and your say-so? Not my say-so. Scientific evidence documented according to legal standards. Evelyn pulled out a leather folder containing the photograph she'd taken, detailed notes about where each hide was found, chemical analysis of the parasites. I spent 7 years learning how to make research bulletproof against people who wanted to discredit it. I know how to build a case. The sheriff's on Crowley's payroll. Maybe, but bank officials and federal marshals aren't. Evelyn's voice hardened. And when Crowley comes here to gloat about taking your ranch, he's going to do it in front of witnesses we can use against him. Coulter was quiet for a long moment, studying this woman who'd appeared in his life a week ago and was now proposing they take down the most powerful man in the territory using nothing but scientific evidence and legal technicalities. You know this is crazy, right? He said finally. I know it's the only chance we have. Evelyn met his eyes. You can shoot Crowley and hang for it, or we can destroy him the right way. Your choice. Coulter thought about the ranch his father had built, the years he'd spent fighting this land for survival, the wife and child he'd lost in this valley that seemed determined to take everything he loved. He thought about giving up, about letting Crowley win, about walking away from the only home he'd ever known. Then he thought about Evelyn standing in the snow with blood on her apron, fighting for cattle that weren't even hers, defending a ranch she'd only come to because she needed something to prove. All right, he said, we do it your way. But if this goes sideways and Crowley walks away laughing, I reserve the right to shoot him anyway. Fair enough. Evelyn allowed herself a small smile. Now, help me organize this evidence. We've got 3 days to build an airtight case. They worked through the night again, but this time it wasn't chemicals and syringes. It was documents and testimonies and legal precedents. Evelyn wrote everything out in precise scientific language, while Coulter provided details about the timeline of the infection, his financial losses, Crowley's previous attempts to acquire the property. Somewhere around 2 in the morning, Coulter made coffee strong enough to strip paint. You ever actually practice law? He asked, setting a cup in front of Evelyn. No. But I sat through enough legal proceedings watching men try to destroy my father's work to learn how the system functions. She took the coffee without looking up from her writing. The trick isn't being right. It's making it impossible for them to dismiss you without looking corrupt themselves. That's a pretty cynical view of justice. That's a realistic view of power. Evelyn finally met his eyes. Justice is what happens when the people with power decide they have more to lose by being obviously corrupt than by doing the right thing. You just have to make the calculation work in your favor. Coulter sat down across from her, cradling his own coffee. Your father teach you that too? No. My father believed the truth would protect him. Evelyn's voice went flat. I learned that lesson watching him die, knowing he'd been right all along and it didn't matter. The silence stretched between them, heavy with things neither knew how to say. I'm sorry, Coulter said finally, about what happened to him. About men like Crowley, who destroy good people because they can. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment, something shifting in her expression, not softening exactly, but opening slightly, like a door that had been locked for too long. Why did you really put that advertisement in the paper? She asked quietly. The truth this time. Coulter set his coffee down, surprised by the question. He'd expected her to deflect, to go back to work, to maintain the professional distance she'd kept since arriving. Because I was tired of being alone, he said after a pause. Tired of waking up in this house with nothing but ghosts and regrets. Figured even a stranger would be better company than another winter by myself. That's honest. You asked for truth. Coulter studied her across the table. What about you? The real reason you chose my advertisement out of all the others? I told you, your ranch was already dying, which meant that's the practical reason, Coulter interrupted. What's the real one? Evelyn went still, For a moment, Coulter thought she wouldn't answer. Then she set down her pen and folded her hands on top of her papers. The advertisement was the only one that didn't promise happiness, she said. All the others, they talked about building a future together, finding joy, creating a loving home. They were selling fantasies. She paused. Yours just said you had a ranch that needed work and you wanted someone to share the burden. It was the only honest one. So you chose me because I was already losing. I chose you because you weren't pretending otherwise. Evelyn's voice was barely above a whisper. I've had enough of men who lie about what they can offer. At least you were honest about having nothing. They sat there in the lamplight, two people who'd both been broken by the world in different ways, who'd both lied to each other and then somehow found something resembling truth in the ruins. Coulter reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Evelyn flinched but didn't pull away. We're going to beat him, Coulter said quietly. Crowley, the bank, all of them. We're going to save this ranch and prove your father's work was real. You don't know that. No. But I know we're both too stubborn to quit without making them bleed for it first. Evelyn laughed, a short, sharp sound that wasn't quite humor, but wasn't despair either. That's probably the most romantic thing anyone's ever said to me. Yeah, well, Coulter squeezed her hand once and let go. Romance ain't exactly my strong suit. They went back to work, but something had shifted between them. Some wall had come down, or some bridge had been built. Coulter wasn't sure which, and he wasn't sure it mattered. All he knew was that for the first time since his wife had died, he didn't feel quite so alone. The day before the foreclosure was scheduled, Evelyn made Coulter ride into town with her. We need witnesses who aren't on Crowley's payroll, she explained as they saddled horses in the pre-dawn darkness. People who'll testify about what they saw if this goes to court. There aren't many people in this valley who'd stand against Crowley, Coulter warned. Then we find the ones desperate enough or angry enough to do it anyway. The town of Millstone Creek was a collection of wooden buildings clustered around a main street that turned to mud whenever it wasn't frozen solid. Most of the businesses belonged to Crowley in one way or another. He owned the general store, the grain elevator, the stockyards, even the saloon where ranchers drank away their profits. But there were holdouts, small operators who'd managed to stay independent through luck or stubbornness. Those were the people Evelyn wanted. Their first stop was the blacksmith shop run by a man named Thomas Webb, a former slave who'd come west after the war and built a reputation as the best metal worker in 3 territories. He was shoeing a horse when they arrived, his dark skin gleaming with sweat despite the cold. Mr. Webb, Evelyn said, we need to talk to you about Victor Crowley. Webb looked up, his expression immediately wary. I don't get involved in range politics. This isn't politics, it's evidence of criminal activity. Evelyn dismounted and approached the forge. Crowley deliberately infected my husband's cattle with blood fever to force a foreclosure. We have proof, but we need witnesses willing to testify if he tries to retaliate. Your husband? Webb glanced at Coulter. Thought you two just met. We got married yesterday, Coulter lied smoothly. Small ceremony. Didn't feel right waiting when the ranch might be gone tomorrow. It was a necessary fiction. Unmarried women couldn't own property in Montana Territory, which meant Evelyn's testimony would carry more weight if she was legally Coulter's wife. They'd ridden into town that morning and paid the justice of the peace $5 to sign the papers without asking too many questions. Coulter still wasn't sure how he felt about being married to a woman who'd lied her way into his life and was now dragging him into a legal battle with the most dangerous man in Montana. But he'd signed the papers anyway. Webb set down his hammer, studying them both carefully. You got real evidence, not just accusations. Evelyn opened her satchel and showed him the photographs, the documented locations of the infected hides, the chemical analysis proving the parasites on Crowley's cattle were identical to the ones that had devastated Iron Hollow. Webb looked through everything slowly, his expression darkening. Son of a bitch, he muttered. I lost 6 head to blood fever last year. Thought it was just bad luck. It wasn't luck, Evelyn said. Crowley's been spreading this disease for at least 18 months, eliminating competitors and buying up their land when they can't recover. And you think you can prove this in court? I think if enough people come forward with similar losses, we can establish a pattern that even corrupt officials can't ignore. Evelyn's voice was steady, but it requires people willing to stand up and say what happened to them. Webb was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. I'll testify. And I know at least 3 other ranchers who'll do the same. Men who lost cattle and property to Crowley's games. Thank you, Evelyn said. Don't thank me yet. Crowley finds out we're organizing against him. He'll come down hard. Webb picked up his hammer again. You better be damn sure you can win this, because if you lose, we all go down with you. They spent the rest of the day visiting small ranchers, independent merchants, anyone who had reason to resent Crowley's dominance. Some turned them away immediately, too afraid of retaliation. Others listened but refused to commit. But a few, the desperate, the angry, the ones who'd already lost too much to care about losing more, agreed to stand with them. By sunset, they had 11 people willing to testify. It wasn't an army, but it was something. On the ride back to Iron Hollow, Coulter watched Evelyn in the fading light. She sat straight in the saddle despite obvious exhaustion, her jaw set with determination that reminded him of soldiers he'd known during the war, people who kept fighting not because they expected to win, but because surrender wasn't in their nature. You ever think about what happens if we actually pull this off? He asked. What do you mean? I mean, if we destroy Crowley and save the ranch and prove your father's research works, what happens then? You go back east, try to publish your findings? Evelyn was quiet for several long moments. I don't know, she said finally. I haven't thought past surviving tomorrow. Maybe you should. Why? Coulter chose his words carefully. Because whether we planned it this way or not, we're married now. And if we're going to stay married, we should probably talk about what that means. It means we signed papers so I could testify in court, Evelyn said, but her voice had gone uncertain. It doesn't have to mean anything beyond that. Doesn't it? They rode in silence for a while, the only sound the creak of saddle leather and the soft crunch of snow under the horses' hooves. I'm not good at this, Evelyn said abruptly. Relationships, trusting people, all the things women are supposed to be natural at. I'm terrible at them. My father used to say I had the emotional instincts of a rock. Your father sounds like he could be kind of an ass sometimes. Evelyn laughed, surprised. He absolutely could be. Brilliant researcher, loving parent, completely oblivious to normal human interaction. She paused. I learned everything I know about science from him, but everything I know about surviving in a world that doesn't want women like me, that I had to figure out alone. You're doing all right so far. Am I? Evelyn turned to look at him. I lied to you about who I was. Used your desperation to get what I needed. Put you in danger from a man who could destroy us both. That's not exactly model wife behavior. Model wife behavior would have had you running the moment you saw how bad things were here, Coulter said. Instead, you stayed and fought and saved my herd when no one else would have tried. So yeah, I'd say you're doing all right. They reached the ranch as full dark settled over the valley. The treated cattle were visible in the corral, healthy and active, living proof that Evelyn's cure worked. Tomorrow, that proof would either save them or mean nothing at all. Coulter helped Evelyn down from her horse, and for a moment they stood close enough that he could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the fear she was trying to hide beneath professional competence. We're going to get through tomorrow, he said quietly. Whatever happens, we face it together. Together, Evelyn repeated, like she was testing the word. I'm not used to that. Me neither. Guess we'll figure it out as we go. Inside the ranch house, they prepared for what was coming. Evelyn organized her evidence into careful stacks, each document labeled and cross-referenced. Coulter cleaned his rifle, not because he planned to use it, but because holding the familiar weight helped him think. Tell me something, Evelyn said as she worked. If this goes wrong tomorrow and Crowley takes the ranch anyway, what will you do? Coulter thought about it. A week ago, the answer would have been simple. He'd have gotten drunk, maybe done something stupid and violent, then drifted until he found another way to get himself killed. But now, watching Evelyn meticulously building their case with the same precision she'd used to save his cattle, the answer felt more complicated. I'd make sure you got out safe, he said finally. Make sure Crowley couldn't touch you for what we tried to do to him. That's not what I asked. It's the only answer that matters. Coulter set the rifle aside. I've lost this ranch before in my head 100 times. Lost everything that mattered to me. But you got a future beyond this place. Got research to publish, your father's name to clear. I won't let Crowley destroy that just because I couldn't hold on to a piece of land. Evelyn had gone very still. When she spoke, her voice was rough. You don't get to make that decision for me. Someone has to think about... No, Evelyn stood up, paper scattering. You don't get to play noble sacrifice because you think I'm worth more than you. That's not how this works. Then how does it work? We both fight or we both run, together. That's what marriage means, doesn't it? She was breathing hard now, something breaking through the careful control she usually maintained. I didn't come all this way and risk everything I have just to watch another man I care about destroy himself trying to protect me. The admission hung in the air between them. Another man I care about. Coulter crossed the room slowly, giving her time to back away if she wanted. She didn't move. Up close, he could see she was shaking, not from fear, but from something deeper, something that had been locked down too long. Evelyn, he said quietly. She kissed him. It wasn't gentle or romantic or anything like the careful courtship society said they should have had. It was desperate and fierce and tasted like coffee and fear and something that might have been hope if they were willing to name it. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Evelyn's hands were fisted in Coulter's shirt. I don't know how to do this, she whispered. How to let someone in. How to trust that they won't leave or die or decide I'm too difficult to deal with. I don't know how to do it either, Coulter admitted. But I know I'm not walking away. Not from you, not from what we're building here. Even if we lose tomorrow? Even then. They stood there in the lamplight, holding on to each other like drowning people who'd found something solid in deep water. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and reminding them that winter wasn't finished with Montana yet. But inside, for the first time in longer than either could remember, something warm was growing. They didn't sleep much that night. Instead, they talked, really talked. Not just strategizing or planning, but sharing the pieces of themselves they usually kept hidden. Coulter told her about his wife, about the guilt that still ate at him for not being there when she died. Evelyn told him about watching her father deteriorate under the weight of professional destruction, about feeling helpless while powerful men crushed everything he'd built. I swore I'd never let them win again, she said as dawn started lightening the windows. That's what this is really about. Not just saving your ranch or proving my cure works. It's about showing men like Crowley that they can't just destroy people who threaten their power. That's a lot of weight to carry, Coulter said. Someone has to carry it. Not alone anymore. Evelyn leaned against him, her head on his shoulder. No, not alone. They watched the sun rise over the Bitterroot Mountains, painting the snow in shades of pink and gold that seemed impossible after so much darkness. The cattle were stirring in their corrals, healthy and alive, proof that impossible things could happen if you were willing to fight hard enough for them. At 9 o'clock, riders appeared on the horizon. Crowley had come to claim his prize. Evelyn and Coulter stood together on the ranch house porch, watching the procession approach. Crowley rode in his fancy carriage, flanked by armed men. Behind him came the sheriff, the bank president, and several other officials whose presence was meant to make this seem legal instead of what it really was. Theft dressed up in paperwork. You ready for this? Coulter asked quietly. Evelyn's hand found his. Ready as I'll ever be. The carriage stopped in front of the house. Crowley stepped down, looking well-fed and satisfied, like a man about to enjoy a meal he'd been anticipating for months. Hayes, he said cheerfully, I assume you got my payment ready? We need to talk before any money changes hands, Coulter said. Talk? Crowley laughed. There's nothing to talk about. You defaulted on your loan. The bank's foreclosing. I'm buying the property. It's all perfectly legal. Is it? Evelyn stepped forward. Because I have evidence suggesting you engineered this default through criminal activity. The smile slipped from Crowley's face. What are you talking about? I'm talking about the infected cattle hides I found on this property. Hides bearing your brand, deliberately placed near the water source to spread blood fever through Mr. Hayes's herd. Evelyn's voice carried across the yard. I'm talking about bioterrorism, Mr. Crowley. A federal crime. For a moment, nobody moved. The sheriff's hand drifted toward his gun. The bank president looked confused. Crowley's expression went from surprise to calculation to cold rage. That's a serious accusation, Mrs. Hayes, he said, his voice dropping the friendly pretense. I hope you can back it up. I can. Evelyn pulled out her documentation. I have photographs of the hides showing your brand. I have chemical analysis proving the parasites match those found on your property. I have testimony from 11 ranchers who suffered similar mysterious disease outbreaks shortly before you bought their land at foreclosure prices. She handed the documents to the sheriff, who looked at them like they might explode. "This don't prove nothing," one of Crowley's men said. "Could be anybody put those hides there." "Could be," Evelyn agreed. "Except I also have shipping records showing you purchased large quantities of arsenic compounds and sulfur, the exact materials needed to preserve infected hides for transport, from a supplier in Denver 3 months before the first outbreak." That was a bluff. She didn't have those records. But the way Crowley's face went white told her the records existed somewhere, and he knew it. "You're insane," Crowley said, but his voice had lost its confidence. "Sheriff, arrest this woman for making false accusations against—" "I ain't arresting nobody until I look at this evidence," the sheriff interrupted, still reading through Evelyn's documents. His expression was troubled. "Ma'am, you're saying Crowley deliberately infected cattle across 3 counties? That's exactly what I'm saying, and I'm prepared to testify to that effect in federal court if necessary." The bank president stepped forward. "Now, hold on. If there's even a possibility that this foreclosure is based on criminal activity, the bank can't proceed until—" "The hell you can't." Crowley turned on him. "We have a contract. The loan is in default. You execute the foreclosure or I'll find another bank that will." "Mr. Crowley," the bank president said carefully, "if this goes to court and we foreclosed knowing there were allegations of criminal conspiracy, the bank could be charged as an accessory. I'm not risking that." Crowley's face was turning red. "You spineless! I want to see these hides," the sheriff said abruptly. "Mrs. Hayes, you said you found them near the water source? I can show you exactly where." For the next hour, Evelyn led the sheriff, the bank president, and a growing crowd of curious onlookers to the spring where she'd discovered the evidence. Crowley followed, his earlier confidence crumbling as more people examined the rotting hides and saw his brand marks clearly visible. "Could have been rustlers," Crowley tried weakly. "Someone stole my cattle, killed them, dumped the bodies here to frame me." "Possible," Evelyn said, "except rustlers typically take live cattle, not disease-ridden carcasses that are worthless for meat or hide. And they certainly don't arrange them in careful patterns designed to maximize disease transmission through a water source." She pointed to how the hides were positioned, upstream of where the cattle drank, partially submerged to keep the parasites alive, weighted down with rocks to prevent them from washing away. "This was deliberate," she said. "Someone with knowledge of disease vectors and animal behavior did this. Someone who understood exactly how to destroy a herd while making it look like natural outbreak." The sheriff was looking at Crowley now with open suspicion. "You know anything about disease vectors, Crowley?" "Of course not. I'm a rancher, not a scientist." "Funny thing," Evelyn said quietly, "because I found correspondence between you and a veterinary college in Chicago discussing blood fever prevention methods. You've been studying this disease for at least 2 years." That wasn't a bluff. She'd found the letters in public records when researching Crowley's background. Crowley's face went from red to pale. His hand drifted toward the gun at his hip. "Don't," Coulter said softly, his rifle already halfway to his shoulder. Everyone froze. "Nobody's shooting anybody," the sheriff said, his own weapon drawn now. "Crowley, you keep your hands where I can see them." "This is ridiculous," Crowley said, but his voice was shaking now. "You're all believing some Eastern woman's fairy tales over a man who's built half this territory." "I'm believing evidence," the sheriff interrupted. "And what I'm seeing here is enough to warrant a formal investigation." He turned to his deputy. "Ride to Helena. Fetch the federal marshal. We got a situation that's bigger than local jurisdiction." The deputy rode off at a gallop. Crowley looked around at the gathered crowd. Ranchers he'd crushed, townspeople he'd bought off, officials who'd turned a blind eye to his activities for years. For the first time, he was seeing fear in their eyes when they looked at him, not respect. "You think you've won something here," he said, staring at Evelyn with pure hatred. "You think you've beaten me with your evidence and your testimony? But I own this valley. I own these people. You're just an outsider playing games you don't understand." "Maybe," Evelyn said calmly, "but I'm an outsider with documented proof of federal crimes. And unlike the people you've been intimidating for years, I've got nothing left to lose." That was when Crowley made his mistake. He drew his gun. Later, people would argue about exactly what happened next, whose shot fired first, whether Crowley actually aimed at Evelyn or just panicked. But Coulter didn't care about later. All he saw was a gun swinging toward the woman he'd married, the woman who'd saved his ranch and maybe saved him too, and his body moved before his mind caught up. He hit Crowley from the side like a falling tree. The gun went off, bullet punching harmlessly into the snow. Both men went down hard, Crowley underneath. Coulter heard ribs crack. Couldn't tell if they were Crowley's or his own, didn't matter. He pinned the bigger man down with his full weight, smashed a fist into Crowley's face once, twice, feeling cartilage give way. "Coulter!" Evelyn's voice sharp and commanding. "Stop!" He stopped, fist raised for another blow, breathing hard. Blood dripped from Crowley's ruined nose onto the white snow. The sheriff and his men had their guns out, but they weren't pointing them at Coulter. "Attempted murder of a witness," the sheriff said flatly, looking at Crowley, "in front of a dozen people including a bank president and 2 county officials. You just made this real easy for the federal marshal." Crowley tried to speak but only managed to spit blood. Coulter climbed off him slowly, his body reminding him he wasn't a young man anymore, and tackling people was a stupid way to get himself killed. Evelyn was there immediately, hands checking him for injuries with clinical efficiency. "I'm fine," he muttered. "You're bleeding." "His blood, not mine." "Don't care. Hold still." He held still while she examined him, aware of the crowd watching, aware that they'd just crossed a line they couldn't uncross. Crowley was being hauled to his feet by the sheriff's men, wrists bound, still spitting blood and curses. "You're both dead," Crowley snarled at them. "You hear me? Dead. I'll destroy you for this." "You already tried that," Evelyn said without looking at him. "It didn't work." They took Crowley away, still struggling and shouting threats that echoed across the frozen valley. The bank president apologized profusely and promised the foreclosure proceedings would be suspended pending investigation. The other ranchers came forward one by one, thanking Evelyn, offering to testify, suddenly brave now that the monster had been declawed. When everyone had finally left and the ranch was quiet again, Coulter and Evelyn stood together on the porch, watching the sun set over land that was still theirs. "We did it," Evelyn said quietly. "We actually did it." "You did it," Coulter corrected. "I just hit a man." "You saved my life." "You saved my ranch first, figured I owed you." Evelyn leaned against him, and he wrapped an arm around her shoulders, holding her close as the temperature dropped and stars began appearing in the darkening sky. They'd won today. But both of them knew this wasn't over. Crowley had money and connections, and men like him didn't go down without fighting back hard. There would be trials, legal battles, retaliation attempts. The victory they'd just earned was fragile and temporary. But for tonight, standing on the porch of Iron Hollow Ranch with the woman who'd traveled across the country to prove something the world said was impossible, Coulter let himself believe they might actually survive this. Together. The peace lasted exactly 4 days. Coulter was checking the fence line along the northern pasture when he saw the smoke. Not the clean white smoke of a cooking fire or the gray haze from a chimney. This was thick and black, billowing up from somewhere near the main road. He kicked his horse into a gallop, heart already knowing what his mind didn't want to accept. Thomas Webb's blacksmith shop was burning. By the time Coulter reached town, half of Millstone Creek had turned out to watch the flames consume the wooden structure. The heat was intense enough to feel from 50 yards away. Webb stood in the street with his face covered in soot, watching everything he'd built turn to ash. "What happened?" Coulter demanded, swinging down from his horse. "What do you think happened?" Webb's voice was hollow. "Crowley's men came in the night, told me to keep my mouth shut about testifying. When I refused, they came back with torches." "Anyone see who did it?" "Half the town saw. Nobody's willing to say so." Webb spat into the dirt. "Crowley might be locked up in Helena waiting for trial, but his money still talks real loud around here." Coulter felt cold rage settling into his chest. "I'll find who did this." "Don't bother. Won't change nothing." Webb turned to face him, eyes red from smoke and something harder than tears. "I'm leaving Montana as soon as I can sell my tools. Going to California where I don't have to worry about getting burned out for telling the truth." "You can't let them win like this." "Can I?" Webb's laugh was bitter. "You and your wife put Crowley in jail, and look what good it did. His hired guns are still out there, still getting paid to make examples of people who stood against him. I got a family to think about, Hayes. I can't afford to be brave anymore." Coulter wanted to argue, wanted to promise that justice would prevail and the law would protect them. But standing there watching the blacksmith shop collapse in on itself, sending sparks into the gray winter sky, the words felt hollow. He rode back to Iron Hollow slowly, dreading what he had to tell Evelyn. She was in the barn when he returned, mixing another batch of treatment solution. 3 more ranchers had shown up that morning, asking if she could cure their cattle. Word was spreading about what she'd accomplished, and desperate men were willing to try anything. Webb's shop burned down last night, Coulter said without preamble. Evelyn's hands went still over her measuring glass. Is he all right? Physically, yeah, but he's leaving Montana. Says he can't afford to testify against Crowley anymore. They threatened him? They threatened him with fire, then made good on it when he didn't back down. Coulter leaned against the barn wall, suddenly exhausted. This is what Crowley does. Even locked up, he's still destroying anyone who stands against him. Evelyn set down her equipment carefully, her scientific precision a thin veneer over the anger Coulter could see building beneath. How many of our witnesses have pulled out? Webb makes 3. The Anderson brothers withdrew their testimony yesterday, said their barn got vandalized and they got the message. Coulter met her eyes. We're losing this, Evelyn. Crowley's lawyers are going to walk him out of jail in a few weeks, and we'll be right back where we started. Except now everyone knows we tried to take him down and failed. We haven't failed yet. We're about to. The federal marshal said without enough witnesses to establish a pattern of criminal activity, all they've got is 1 incident of diseased cattle on our property. Could have been an accident, could have been us planting evidence to frame Crowley. Without corroboration, it's our word against the richest man in Montana. Evelyn was quiet for a long moment. Then she walked to the barn door and stared out at the snow-covered valley, her shoulders rigid. My father used to say that the measure of a scientist isn't whether their first experiment succeeds, she said quietly. It's whether they keep trying after it fails. This isn't a laboratory experiment. These are people's lives. I know that. She turned to face him, and Coulter saw something fierce and uncompromising in her expression, which is why we can't give up. Because if we do, Crowley wins. And every other powerful man who thinks he can destroy people without consequences wins too. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting we take the fight to him instead of waiting for his hired guns to pick us off one by one. Evelyn crossed the barn, moving with the decisive energy that always preceded her most dangerous ideas. The federal trial is scheduled for 3 weeks from now in Helena. Crowley's lawyers are going to argue that we fabricated evidence, that the diseased hides could have come from anywhere, that there's no proof he deliberately spread the infection. Right. Which is why we need witnesses to— We don't need witnesses, Evelyn interrupted. We need to prove the disease couldn't have spread naturally. We need to show that the infection pattern across multiple ranches follows a deliberate timeline that matches Crowley's property acquisitions. Coulter stared at her. How the hell do we do that? We map it. Evelyn was already moving toward the house, her mind clearly racing ahead. Every ranch that suffered blood fever in the past 2 years. We document when the infection appeared, how it spread, which properties Crowley acquired afterward. If we can show a clear pattern of outbreak followed by foreclosure followed by purchase, it establishes intent. That would take weeks of research. Then we better start now. They worked like people possessed. Evelyn sent letters to every veterinarian, livestock inspector, and county clerk within 200 miles, requesting records of cattle disease outbreaks. Coulter rode to neighboring ranches, talking to men who'd lost herds and land, piecing together timelines that most people wanted to forget. The pattern that emerged was damning. Over 18 months, 11 ranches had experienced sudden blood fever outbreaks. 10 of those ranches had been foreclosed on within 4 months. 9 of those foreclosed properties had been purchased by shell companies that led back to Crowley's holdings. The statistical probability of that being coincidence was astronomical. This is it, Evelyn said, spreading maps across the kitchen table. She'd marked each affected property with pins and colored thread showing the progression of disease. This is proof of systematic bioterrorism for financial gain. It's circumstantial, Coulter cautioned. His lawyers will say it's just bad luck in a bad economy. Bad luck doesn't follow a geographic pattern radiating out from Crowley's main ranch like ripples in a pond. Evelyn traced the threads with her finger. Look. The first outbreak was on the property directly adjacent to his northern border. Then it jumped to the next ranch over. Then the next. Each time moving away from his land, each time devastating a competitor. You're saying he used his own infected cattle as weapons. I'm saying he deliberately maintained a reservoir of infected animals and strategically moved diseased hides to neighboring properties to spread the parasites. Evelyn's voice was cold with scientific certainty. It's elegant in a horrifying way. Natural disease spread is random and chaotic. This pattern is controlled and directional. Coulter Knapp seeing what she saw. The methodical destruction of an entire valley's independent ranchers, executed with the precision of a military campaign. "We need to get this to the federal marshal," he said. "We need to get this to someone Crowley can't buy or intimidate." Evelyn pulled out a piece of paper she'd been keeping separate from the rest of her documentation. "I wrote to the Department of Agriculture in Washington, explained what we discovered, sent copies of the evidence. They're sending an investigator to Helena for the trial." "When were you planning to mention this?" "When I knew for sure he was coming. His telegram arrived this morning." She showed Coulter the message. "Dr. Henry Winslow, senior livestock pathologist. He'll be in Helena in 10 days. Coulter read the telegram twice, trying to process what it meant. This could actually work. It has to work. Evelyn's hands were trembling slightly, the only sign of the strain she was under. "Because I'm out of backup plans." The next 10 days blurred together in a haze of preparation and mounting tension. More ranchers came to Iron Hollow asking for Evelyn's cure, and she treated their cattle while simultaneously documenting each case for her upcoming testimony. Coulter hired 2 men to watch the property at night after finding horse tracks near the barn that didn't belong to anyone who'd visited legitimately. Sleep became something they stole in 3-hour increments between work shifts. "You're going to collapse if you don't rest," Coulter told Evelyn on the 8th night, finding her still at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning. "I'll rest after the trial." "Evelyn, I can't stop, Coulter." She looked up at him, and he saw the exhaustion carved into her face. "If I stop, I start thinking about all the ways this could fail. About what happens if Crowley walks free. About whether we just made everything worse by standing up to him." Coulter sat down across from her, taking her ink-stained hands in his. "You know what your father would say right now? That I should be more careful with my measurements? That you've already won the important fight." Coulter squeezed her hands gently. "You proved his research works. You saved lives. You showed that a woman can be just as good a scientist as any man, better even, because you didn't let pride or politics get in the way of saving cattle. That's not enough. Maybe not, but it's something." He paused. "And whatever happens in Helena, I want you to know. I'm proud of you for what you've done here, for who you are, for not backing down when every reasonable person would have run." Evelyn's eyes were suddenly bright. "You're not supposed to be sweet. You're supposed to be a gruff frontier rancher who doesn't share his feelings. Yeah, well, you're not supposed to be a scientific genius pretending to be a mail-order bride. Guess we're both full of surprises." She laughed, a real laugh this time, not the brittle edge of panic she'd been living with for days. Then she leaned across the table and kissed him, tasting like coffee and determination. "Come to bed," Coulter said when they broke apart. "Whatever happens tomorrow, we'll handle it better if we're not dead on our feet." For once, she didn't argue. They left for Helena the next morning, the wagon loaded with documentation, evidence, and everything they'd built their case on. The federal courthouse was a 3-day journey through mountain passes still choked with late-season snow. On the second night, they stayed at a roadhouse halfway between Millstone Creek and Helena. The proprietor recognized Coulter and refused to take his money. "Heard what you and your wife did to Crowley," the old man said, sliding 2 room keys across the bar. "About damn time someone stood up to that bastard. Drinks are on the house." Word was spreading faster than Coulter had realized. The story of how a dying rancher and his scientist bride had exposed a cattle baron's criminal empire had become something bigger than them. It was becoming a symbol for everyone who'd been crushed by men like Crowley and told there was nothing they could do about it. No pressure, Coulter thought grimly. In their room that night, Evelyn sat by the window staring out at the snow-covered mountains. "What if we lose?" she asked quietly. "Then we lose. But at least we fought." "That's not good enough." She turned to face him. "I need this to work, Coulter. Not just for us or for the ranch. For everyone who testified, everyone who's watching to see if standing up to power actually means anything. You can't carry that weight by yourself. Someone has to." "No," Coulter said firmly. "We carry it together. That's what partners do." Evelyn came to bed finally, curling against him in the darkness. "I'm scared," she admitted. I've been scared this whole time, and I hate it. Being scared doesn't make you weak. Doing the work anyway, that's what makes you strong. You sound like my father. I'll take that as a compliment. They held each other while the wind howled outside. Two people who'd found each other by accident and were now bound together by something deeper than either had planned for. Helena was bigger than Millstone Creek, a territorial capital bustling with politicians, lawyers, and the machinery of government. The federal courthouse dominated the main square, a massive stone building that looked like it had been built to intimidate. Dr. Henry Winslow met them in the lobby the morning before the trial was scheduled to begin. He was younger than Evelyn expected, maybe 40, with the kind of intense focus she recognized from her father. He examined her documentation with the same careful precision she would have used, asking sharp questions that proved he actually understood the science. "This is extraordinary work," he said after an hour of review. "The disease mapping alone would be publishable in any agricultural journal. But combined with the chemical analysis of the parasites and the geographic correlation to property acquisitions," he looked up at Evelyn with something like respect. "Mrs. Hayes, you've built a case that would be difficult to refute even without witness testimony. Will it be enough to convict Crowley? That's for the jury to decide, but you've given them everything they need to understand what he did and why it matters." Winslow paused. "I am curious about one thing, though. How did a woman with your level of expertise end up on a Montana ranch instead of working at a research university?" The question hung in the air between them. Evelyn could have lied, could have deflected, but she was tired of pretending. "Because research universities don't hire women," she said bluntly. "Because my father's colleagues destroyed his reputation after he died, and I was left with knowledge nobody would acknowledge and research nobody would publish. So I came here, where people were desperate enough to let me prove what I could do." Winslow nodded slowly. "The agricultural science establishment is full of fools who care more about credentials than competence. For what it's worth, if you ever want to publish this work under your own name, I'll personally submit it to the Journal of Veterinary Medicine with my endorsement." "Thank you," Evelyn said, surprised by how much the offer meant. The trial started the next morning. The courtroom was packed. Ranchers from across Montana Territory, journalists from Denver and San Francisco, even a reporter from a New York newspaper who'd traveled west specifically to cover what he was calling the Cattle Baron conspiracy trial. Crowley sat at the defense table looking confident and well-rested, flanked by 3 expensive lawyers from Chicago. He smiled when he saw Evelyn and Coulter enter, a smile that promised revenge regardless of how the trial ended. The prosecution called Evelyn as their first witness. She took the stand feeling every eye in the courtroom on her, aware that everything she'd worked for came down to the next few hours. The prosecutor, a territorial attorney general named Morrison, walked her through her findings methodically, letting her explain the science in terms a jury could understand. "Mrs. Hayes," Morrison said, "can you explain to the jury how you determined the cattle disease on your husband's ranch was deliberately introduced?" Evelyn took a breath and began. She explained parasitic ticks, how they spread disease, what conditions they needed to survive. She showed the jury photographs of the infected hides found at Iron Hollow, pointed out the placement near the water source, explained why natural disease spread wouldn't follow that pattern. Then she unrolled the map showing 18 months of outbreaks across Montana Territory. "This is not random chance," she said clearly. "This is systematic, deliberate distribution of an infectious agent designed to cause maximum economic damage to specific properties. And the only person who benefited financially from each outbreak was Victor Crowley." Crowley's lead lawyer, a slick Chicago attorney named Hartwell, objected immediately. "Speculation, Your Honor. The witness is drawing conclusions without direct evidence." "The witness is presenting expert analysis based on documented patterns," Morrison countered. The judge, a stern woman named Catherine Ward, who'd made history as Montana's first female territorial judge, studied the map carefully. "I'll allow it," she said. "Continue, Mrs. Hayes." Evelyn walked the jury through each outbreak, each foreclosure, each property acquisition. She showed them the statistical impossibility of coincidence. She presented chemical analysis proving the parasites on Crowley's branded hides were identical to those found across multiple ranches. It took 3 hours. When she finished, the courtroom was dead silent. Then Hartwell stood for cross-examination, and Evelyn knew the real fight was beginning. "Mrs. Hayes," he said smoothly, "you're not a licensed veterinarian, are you?" "No." "Not a certified livestock inspector?" No. In fact, you have no formal credentials in animal medicine at all, do you? I have 7 years of practical research experience under a respected pathologist. That's worth more than any certificate, perhaps. But the fact remains you're testifying as an expert witness without any recognized qualifications. Hartwell smiled. Tell me, how exactly did you come to be living on Mr. Hayes's ranch? Evelyn saw where this was going. I married him. Quite suddenly, I understand, within days of arriving in Montana territory. Hartwell consulted his notes. Isn't it true you answered a mail-order bride advertisement specifically targeting Mr. Hayes's failing ranch? Yes. And isn't it also true you came to Montana with chemicals, scientific equipment, and a predetermined plan to conduct experiments on his cattle? I came with the knowledge and materials necessary to save his herd from a disease that was killing them. Or, Hartwell said, his voice sharpening, you came to Montana to stage an elaborate fraud, planting evidence on Mr. Hayes's property to frame my client for crimes he didn't commit, all in service of gaining attention for research that the scientific establishment had already rejected as worthless. Coulter started to rise from his seat, but Morrison put a hand on his arm. Evelyn kept her voice level. The research is sound. The evidence is real. And your client's guilt is documented in 18 months of systematic bioterrorism. Alleged bioterrorism, based on your interpretation of circumstantial evidence. Hartwell leaned forward. Mrs. Hayes, isn't the real truth that you're a desperate woman with a grudge against successful cattlemen who manipulated a vulnerable rancher into supporting wild theories because you needed someone to believe your dead father's discredited work? The courtroom erupted. Judge Ward's gavel cracked like a gunshot. Order! Mr. Hartwell, you will confine your questions to the evidence at hand, or I will hold you in contempt. But the damage was done. Evelyn could see the jury's faces shifting, doubt creeping in. A woman with no credentials married suspiciously quickly to a rancher who stood to benefit from accusing his competitor. It was exactly the kind of story that confirmed people's worst assumptions about ambitious women who didn't know their place. No further questions, Hartwell said, sitting down with a satisfied expression. Evelyn stepped down from the witness stand feeling like she'd just lost everything. Dr. Winslow testified next, lending his credentials and authority to Evelyn's findings. He walked through the same evidence, explained the same patterns, reached the same conclusions. The jury listened respectfully, but Evelyn could see they were still uncertain, swayed by Hartwell's insinuations about her motives. The defense called its own experts, veterinarians who testified that blood fever was common, that disease outbreaks happened randomly, that there was no way to prove deliberate infection versus natural spread. It was Evelyn's research against the established scientific consensus. A woman nobody had heard of versus credentialed professionals who'd published papers and taught at universities. The trial lasted 4 days. On the final day, Crowley himself took the stand. He was calm, sympathetic, playing the role of a successful businessman being persecuted by jealous competitors. He claimed the branded hides must have been stolen from his property months ago, that he had no knowledge of any disease-spreading scheme, that he'd simply been buying distressed properties at fair market value. I'm a victim here, he told the jury earnestly. A victim of fraud perpetrated by a desperate rancher and his overly ambitious wife who thought they could destroy my reputation to cover their own financial failures. Watching him perform, Evelyn felt sick. He was good at this, better than she'd anticipated. The jury was listening to him the way people listen to authority, nodding along with his explanations. When the prosecution rested, Morrison looked exhausted and pessimistic. We did our best, he told Evelyn and Coulter in the hallway. But Hartwell's good, and he's planted enough reasonable doubt that I'm not confident about a conviction. What are our chances? Coulter asked. 50-50. Maybe worse. Morrison gathered his papers. Judge Ward is sympathetic, but she can't direct the jury to convict. It's in their hands now. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Evelyn and Coulter sat on a bench outside the courtroom, not talking, just existing in the terrible limbo of waiting. Other spectators wandered past, some offering encouraging words, others looking at them with pity. Finally, the bailiff emerged. Juries reached a verdict. The courtroom filled quickly, everyone sensing this was a moment that would matter beyond just one trial. Evelyn took her seat next to Coulter, their hands clasped so tight her fingers were going numb. The jury filed in, their faces unreadable. Judge Ward addressed the foreman. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor." "On the charge of bioterrorism and intentional disease distribution, how do you find the defendant?" The foreman looked directly at Crowley. "Guilty." The courtroom exploded with sound, shouts, gasps, applause, outrage. Crowley's face went white, then red, his lawyers immediately objecting and demanding a mistrial. Judge Ward's gavel cracked repeatedly, fighting for order. Evelyn couldn't breathe. They'd won. Against all odds, against Crowley's money and lawyers and influence, they'd actually won. Coulter pulled her into his arms, and she buried her face against his shoulder, shaking with relief and exhaustion, and something that might have been tears if she let herself acknowledge them. "We did it," Coulter said into her hair. "You did it." Judge Ward sentenced Crowley to 8 years in federal prison and ordered him to pay restitution to every rancher whose property he deliberately infected. His lawyers filed appeals immediately, but the verdict stood. Montana's most powerful cattle baron had fallen, brought down by a mail-order bride with a chemistry set and the courage to fight back. The story made newspapers across the country. The New York Times ran it on the front page. "Woman Scientist Exposes Montana Cattle Conspiracy." Harper's Weekly published a full feature with illustrations of Evelyn working in her makeshift laboratory. Marriage proposals and job offers arrived by the dozen. Universities suddenly interested in her research now that it had proven valuable. Medical journals requesting articles. Even a publisher in Boston wanting to turn the story into a book. Evelyn burned most of them without reading past the first paragraph. "You're turning down Harvard?" Coulter asked, watching her feed another letter to the stove. "They didn't want me 6 months ago when I was desperate for a position. They want me now because I'm famous, and they think I'll bring them prestige." She tossed in another envelope. "They can all go to hell." "What about the journal publications? Those could help you rebuild your father's reputation." Evelyn paused at that, holding a letter from the American Veterinary Review. "Maybe. If I can publish his original research alongside mine, show that my work was built on his foundation. So do that. And then what? Spend the rest of my life in lecture halls teaching students who'll never have to prove themselves the way I did? Travel the academic circuit giving talks to men who'll smile to my face and dismiss me behind my back?" She looked at him. "That's not what I want anymore." "What do you want?" Evelyn moved to the kitchen window, staring out at Iron Hollow Ranch covered in early spring snow that was finally starting to melt. The cattle were healthy, grazing peacefully in pastures that had looked like graveyards 3 months ago. "I want this," she said quietly. "I want to keep treating sick animals and developing better cures. I want to publish papers that actually help ranchers instead of just impressing other scientists. I want to build something real instead of chasing credentials that don't mean anything." Coulter came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "You sure? That life's a lot harder than a university position." "I'm sure." She leaned back against him. "I didn't come to Montana to be comfortable. I came here to prove something, and I'm not done yet." "What about your father's legacy?" "My father's legacy is that he taught me how to think, how to question, how to keep pushing when everyone says you're wrong." Evelyn turned in his arms to face him. "The best way I can honor that is by living a life he'd be proud of, not by fighting for acceptance from people who never deserved his respect in the first place." Coulter smiled. "You know, you're probably the most stubborn woman in Montana territory." "Probably? I'm definitely the most stubborn woman in Montana territory." "Good." He kissed her. "I'd be bored otherwise." That night, ranchers from across the valley came to Iron Hollow for an impromptu celebration. Someone brought whiskey, someone else brought a fiddle, and soon the barn was full of people who'd spent years living in fear of Victor Crowley, finally allowing themselves to believe they might actually be free. Thomas Webb was there, having decided to stay in Montana after all. "Figured if you two could take down Crowley, maybe this territory's worth fighting for after all," he told them. Even the sheriff showed up, looking embarrassed but genuine. "I should have stood up to him years ago," he said to Evelyn. "You did what I was too much of a coward to do. Thank you." Evelyn accepted the gratitude awkwardly, still not comfortable being treated like a hero. She'd just done what needed doing, used the skills her father had taught her to solve a problem no one else would touch. But watching these people celebrate, seeing the hope return to faces that had been marked by resignation and fear, She started to understand that sometimes solving one problem could change everything. Late in the night, after most people had gone home, and the barn was quiet again, Evelyn and Coulter stood together in the doorway watching the stars emerge over the Bitterroot Mountains. "You think Crowley's lawyers will get him out?" Coulter asked. "Maybe. Probably," Evelyn shrugged. "But it doesn't matter anymore. We proved he's not untouchable. That's worth more than any prison sentence." "How do you figure?" "Because next time someone like him tries to crush people who can't fight back, they'll remember what happened here. They'll remember that a dying rancher and a woman nobody believed stopped him cold." She smiled. "Fear's a powerful weapon, and now he's the one who should be afraid." Coulter pulled her closer. "You're a little bit terrifying sometimes, you know that?" "You're just figuring that out now?" "No, just appreciating it more." They stayed there until the cold drove them inside. Two people who'd started as strangers bound by desperation and become something neither had names for yet, but both recognized as real. The ranch that had been dying 3 months ago was alive again, saved by science and stubbornness and the refusal to accept that power always wins. And somewhere in Montana Territory, other people watching the Iron Hollow story unfold were starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could fight back too. Spring came to Montana like an apology, melting the snow that had buried the valley for months and revealing land that looked ready to start over. The cattle at Iron Hollow grew fat on new grass, their coats glossy and healthy, living proof that Evelyn's cure had worked better than anyone expected. But success brought its own complications. The ranchers who showed up at their door weren't just from Montana anymore. They came from Wyoming, Idaho, even as far as Colorado, men who'd heard about the woman who could cure blood fever and were willing to travel hundreds of miles for a chance to save their herds. Evelyn treated them all. She set up a proper laboratory in the barn, mixing compounds in quantities she'd never attempted before, teaching Coulter the precise measurements and timing required for each treatment. They worked 16-hour days, falling into bed exhausted only to wake before dawn and start again. "You're going to work yourself to death," Coulter told her one morning, finding her already in the barn at 4 a.m. "There's a rancher from Cheyenne arriving today with 12 infected cattle. If I don't have the treatment ready, the treatment can wait an hour while you eat breakfast and sleep like a human being." Evelyn turned to face him, dark circles under her eyes, her hair escaping from its pins. "These people are desperate, Coulter. They're losing everything, just like you were. I can't turn them away because I need rest." "You can't help anyone if you collapse from exhaustion." "I'm fine." "You're not fine. You haven't been fine since the trial ended." Coulter crossed the barn, taking the beaker from her hands before she could protest. "What's going on, Evelyn?" She tried to pull away, but he held her gently in place, waiting. "I keep thinking about all the ranchers we couldn't save," she said finally. "All the ones who lost their herds before we figured out what Crowley was doing. All the families ruined because I wasn't fast enough or smart enough to stop him sooner. That's not your fault, isn't it? I had the knowledge to cure this disease for years. If I'd been braver, if I'd fought harder to get my research published instead of running to Montana, you'd be dead or destroyed like your father," Coulter interrupted. "You can't blame yourself for surviving, Evelyn." "Then who do I blame?" "Crowley. The system that protected him. The people who valued money over lives." Coulter cupped her face in his hands. "But not yourself. You saved my ranch. You're saving dozens of others. You took down the most powerful man in Montana Territory. That's more than most people accomplish in a lifetime." Evelyn closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. "It doesn't feel like enough. It never does. But you can't carry every rancher's pain on your shoulders." He kissed her forehead. "Come inside. Eat. Rest for an hour. The cure will still be there when you get back." She let him lead her to the house, too tired to keep fighting. They ate in silence, eggs and coffee that Coulter had learned to make strong enough to satisfy Evelyn's exacting standards. Outside, the sun was rising over the mountains, painting everything gold. "I got a letter from the territorial governor yesterday," Coulter said casually. Evelyn looked up. "About what?" "About you. He wants to commission you as the official livestock disease inspector for Montana Territory. Salary, authority to quarantine infected herds, budget for research." He paused. "It's a real position, legitimate, the kind of thing that could change everything. I don't want to work for the government. You haven't even heard the details." "I don't need to." Evelyn set down her coffee. Government positions come with rules and bureaucracy and people telling you what you can and can't research. I'd end up spending more time writing reports than actually helping ranchers. Or you'd have resources to do this work properly instead of mixing compounds in a barn at 4 in the morning. Evelyn was quiet, considering. What do you think I should do? I think you should do whatever lets you sleep at night. Coulter reached across the table, taking her hand. But I also think you can't save every ranch by yourself. Maybe it's time to teach other people how to do what you do. That idea stuck with Evelyn as the weeks passed and more ranchers arrived seeking treatment. She started keeping detailed notes on each case, documenting which compounds worked best for different stages of infection, which application methods were most effective, what warning signs to watch for. By early summer, she had enough material for a comprehensive treatment manual. You could publish this, Dr. Winslow said when he visited Iron Hollow to check on her progress. He'd become something of a mentor and advocate, helping her navigate the scientific establishment that had rejected her father's work. Every veterinary school in the country would use it as a textbook, and every cattle baron would use it to protect their own herds while still sabotaging their competitors, Evelyn countered. I've seen how these men operate. They don't want knowledge shared, they want advantages they can exploit. So make it free. Publish it as a public bulletin through the Department of Agriculture. No copyright, no fees, just information available to anyone who needs it. Evelyn considered that. The universities would hate it. They'd say I'm undermining their authority, giving away knowledge that should be controlled by certified professionals. Let them hate it, Winslow smiled. The point isn't to make the universities happy. It's to make sure ranchers don't lose their livelihoods because knowledge was locked behind academic walls. She published the manual in August. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Newspapers printed excerpts. Agricultural journals that had rejected her father's work suddenly wanted to interview her about methodology. The Department of Agriculture ordered 10,000 copies distributed across the Western Territories, and the hate mail started arriving. The first letter came from a veterinary college in Boston, accusing her of practicing medicine without credentials and endangering public health. The second was from a ranchers association in Texas, claiming her treatments were unproven and dangerous. The third was from a lawyer representing the American Cattlemen's Union, threatening legal action if she didn't cease distribution of her manual immediately. They're terrified of you, Coulter said, reading through the threatening correspondence. You've made their expensive treatments obsolete. They're angry that a woman figured out something they couldn't. Evelyn tossed another letter onto the pile. This is exactly what they did to my father. Discredit the research, attack the credentials, threaten lawsuits until people back down. What are you going to do? Ignore them. Evelyn's voice was ice. They can threaten all they want. The manual is already published. Ranchers are already using it successfully. They can't put that knowledge back in the bottle, no matter how much they wish they could. But the threats escalated. Someone filed a formal complaint with the Montana Territorial Medical Board, claiming Evelyn was practicing veterinary medicine without a license. The board, staffed by men whose donations came from the same cattlemen Evelyn had exposed, scheduled a hearing to investigate the matter. This is harassment, Coulter said when the summons arrived. They're trying to intimidate you into stopping. It's working. Evelyn sat at the kitchen table, staring at the official seal on the document. If they revoke my right to practice in Montana, everything we've built falls apart. Can they actually do that? They can do whatever they want. The law's on their side. I don't have a veterinary license because no school would admit me to study for one. Technically, every treatment I've performed has been illegal practice of medicine. Coulter felt cold rage settling into his chest. The same rage he'd felt watching Crowley threaten Evelyn, watching powerful men try to destroy someone who'd only ever tried to help people. Then we fight, he said. Same way we fought Crowley. We get evidence, we get witnesses. We show them they can't win. This is different. Crowley broke the law. I'm the one breaking it now, even if the law is wrong. The law that says women can't be doctors is wrong. The law that protects veterinarians who charge desperate ranchers a fortune while providing worthless treatments is wrong. We find a way to fight it anyway. Evelyn looked at him with something like wonder. You really believe that, don't you? That we can keep winning just by being stubborn enough? I believe we don't quit before we're actually beaten. Coulter pulled her to her feet. Now come on. We've got a hearing to prepare for. They spent 2 weeks building their defense. Evelyn compiled testimonials from every rancher she'd helped, documented success rates that put licensed veterinarians to shame, gathered evidence showing her treatments were safer and more effective than anything the medical establishment offered. Coulter reached out to the ranchers who'd testified against Crowley, asking if they'd stand with Evelyn again. Most agreed immediately. They owed her their livelihoods and weren't about to let bureaucrats destroy the woman who'd saved them. The hearing was scheduled for late September in Helena, in the same courthouse where they'd taken down Victor Crowley 6 months earlier. "Feels like we're always fighting in that building," Evelyn said as they prepared to leave Iron Hollow. "Maybe it's lucky for us. Or maybe Montana just really hates people who challenge the status quo." They arrived in Helena 2 days before the hearing to find the town buzzing with news. Crowley's appeals had finally run out. He was being transferred to federal prison to begin serving his 8-year sentence. But more importantly, his financial empire was collapsing. Properties were being seized to pay restitution, shell companies dissolved, business partners abandoning him to save themselves. The cattle baron who'd once controlled half of Montana territory was finished. "Wish we could celebrate properly," Coulter said, reading the newspaper in their hotel room. "But we've got our own battle to fight first." The hearing opened with the medical board laying out their case against Evelyn. She had no formal credentials. She had practiced veterinary medicine without a license. She had distributed treatment protocols without oversight from qualified professionals. Each point was technically accurate, even if the context made them absurd. The board's attorney, a thin man named Pritchard with a voice like a rusty hinge, questioned Evelyn with barely concealed disdain. "Mrs. Hayes, where did you receive your veterinary training?" "I didn't attend veterinary school. I learned through 7 years of practical research with my father." "Your father who was discredited for fraudulent research?" "My father who was destroyed by men who couldn't accept that his work challenged their profits." Evelyn kept her voice level. The research was sound, the science was real, the only fraud was claiming otherwise. "That's your opinion." The medical establishment disagreed. "The medical establishment was wrong." Pritchard's smile was thin and cold. "How convenient that you can simply dismiss expert consensus when it contradicts your claims." "Expert consensus once said bloodletting cured disease and women's brains were too small for scientific thought," Evelyn shot back. "Consensus isn't the same as truth," the gallery murmured. Judge Ward, presiding over this hearing as she had over Crowley's trial, watched with interest. Pritchard continued pressing, trying to paint Evelyn as a dangerous amateur playing at medicine. But every time he made a point, Evelyn countered with documented evidence of successful treatments, ranchers whose herds she'd saved, mortality rates that proved her methods worked. "The question isn't whether my treatments work," Evelyn said finally, her patience exhausted. "The question is whether you care more about protecting professional credentials than saving ranchers' livelihoods, because that's what this hearing is really about. Maintaining a system that benefits established veterinarians regardless of whether they're actually helping anyone." "That's a serious accusation, Mrs. Hayes." "It's an accurate one. How many ranchers have lost their herds while waiting for licensed veterinarians to develop treatments that actually work? How many families have been ruined because knowledge was locked behind academic walls?" Evelyn leaned forward. "I published my manual for free because people were dying and I had the cure. If that's illegal, then your laws are protecting the wrong people." The hearing lasted 3 days. Rancher after rancher testified about Evelyn's treatment saving their cattle. Dr. Winslow provided expert testimony confirming her methods were scientifically sound. Even the territorial governor sent a letter supporting her work and requesting the board dismiss the charges. But the medical board was unmoved. On the final day, they delivered their verdict. Evelyn would be prohibited from practicing veterinary medicine in Montana Territory unless she obtained proper credentials from an accredited institution. Since no accredited institution would admit a woman to their veterinary program, it was effectively a lifetime ban. The courtroom erupted in protests. Ranchers shouted at the board members, calling them corrupt and bought. Judge Ward's gavel cracked repeatedly, fighting for order. Evelyn sat perfectly still, feeling everything she'd built crumbling around her. Coulter's hand found hers under the table, squeezing tight. "We appeal," he said quietly. "Take this to federal court. Argue it's discriminatory." "No." Evelyn's voice was hollow. "They won, Coulter. They found a legal way to stop me, and fighting it will take years we don't have. By the time any appeal gets heard, dozens more ranchers will have lost their herds. So what do we do? Evelyn stood, straightening her shoulders despite feeling like she'd been gutted. We find another way. They left Helena that afternoon, the verdict hanging over them like a death sentence. The ride back to Iron Hollow was silent, both of them too wrapped up in their own thoughts to make conversation. It wasn't until they were home, standing in the barn that had become Evelyn's laboratory, that she finally spoke. "They can't stop me from teaching," she said quietly. Coulter looked up. "What?" "The ruling says I can't practice veterinary medicine. It doesn't say I can't teach other people how to treat their own cattle." Evelyn's mind was racing now, seeing possibilities. "If I train ranchers to use my methods themselves, the medical board has no authority. It's not practicing medicine. It's agricultural education. That's a loophole. That's the only path left." Evelyn turned to face him. "We turn Iron Hollow into a teaching ranch. Invite ranchers here for training courses. Show them how to identify disease, mix treatments, apply cures. Give them the knowledge to save their own herds without needing me or any licensed veterinarian." Coulter thought about it, seeing the brilliance and the danger. "The medical board will try to shut that down too. Let them try. Agricultural education isn't regulated the same way medical practice is. They'd have to convince lawmakers to pass new restrictions, and every rancher in Montana would fight that legislation." She was pacing now, energized by the idea. "We make knowledge so widely available, they can't contain it anymore. Democratize veterinary medicine until the gatekeepers become irrelevant." That's ambitious. That's necessary. Evelyn stopped pacing, looking at Coulter. "I can't practice medicine myself anymore." "Fine. But I can make sure every rancher in the West knows how to save their own cattle. That's better than what I was doing before. Instead of treating animals one at a time, I'll create an army of people who can do it themselves." Coulter crossed the barn and pulled her into his arms. "You know this is going to make you even more enemies, right? The universities, the veterinary colleges, every establishment that profits from keeping knowledge scarce, they're all going to come after you. Let them come." Evelyn's voice was steel-wrapped in exhaustion. "I'm tired of fighting defensive battles. Time to make them react to us for a change." They started planning that night. Converting the ranch into a teaching facility would require construction, additional barns for housing students, classroom space for lectures, expanded laboratory facilities for practical training. It would cost money they didn't have and time they couldn't spare. But ranchers who'd benefited from Evelyn's treatments started sending donations. Small amounts at first, $10 here, $20 there, but it added up. Thomas Webb offered to handle construction at cost. The territorial governor quietly arranged for a grant from the Agricultural Development Fund. By October, they were ready to begin. The first class arrived in early November. 6 ranchers from across Montana, desperate men who'd lost cattle and couldn't afford licensed veterinarians. Evelyn taught them everything: disease identification, parasite biology, treatment chemistry, application methods. She held nothing back, sharing knowledge that had cost her father his life and her years of struggle. "Why are you giving this away?" one student asked. "You could charge a fortune for this information." "Because knowledge isn't worth anything if people who need it can't access it," Evelyn said. "My father believed that, died believing it. I'm not going to betray that principle just because the system punished him for it." The students learned quickly, motivated by the knowledge that this training could save their livelihoods. They practiced mixing compounds until they could do it blindfolded, studied disease progression until they could diagnose infections at a glance, worked cattle until the treatment application became second nature. After 2 weeks, Evelyn sent them home with detailed manuals and enough supplies to treat their first cases. "Come back if you need help," she told them, "and teach others what you've learned. That's the only way we win, by making this knowledge so widespread they can't suppress it anymore." The students went home and saved their herds. Then they taught their neighbors. Those neighbors taught others. Knowledge spread like wildfire across Montana territory and beyond, carried by ranchers who'd been given tools to fight diseases that had previously meant certain ruin. By spring, Iron Hollow Ranch had trained 40 ranchers. By summer, that number was over 100. Students came from Wyoming, Idaho, the Dakotas, even as far as Kansas and Nebraska. They slept in the new bunkhouse Coulter had built, studied in the converted barn, practiced on cattle that Evelyn kept specifically for training purposes. The ranch that had been dying a year ago was now the center of an agricultural revolution. But success came with attention Evelyn didn't want. The American Veterinary Medical Association filed a lawsuit claiming Iron Hollow was operating an unlicensed educational institution. The Montana Medical Board tried to shut down the training program as illegal medicine instruction. Threatening letters arrived weekly, some from professional organizations, others from anonymous senders promising violence if Evelyn didn't stop. Maybe we should hire security, Coulter suggested, after finding a particularly graphic death threat. We can't afford security. We can't afford you getting killed either. Evelyn set down the letter, her hands remarkably steady. They're trying to scare us into quitting. If we bring in armed guards, it looks like we think we're doing something wrong, like we're afraid. We should be afraid. These people destroyed your father. They tried to destroy you. They're not going to stop just because we keep fighting. I know. Evelyn met his eyes. But I also know that if we quit now, everything we've done means nothing. Every rancher we've trained, every herd we've saved, every person who believed we could change things, they all lose if we back down. I'm not suggesting we quit. I'm suggesting we protect ourselves while we fight. Fair enough. Evelyn thought about it. Talk to Webb. See if he knows anyone reliable who needs work. But make it clear they're here to help run the ranch, not to play bodyguard. I won't give our enemies the satisfaction of thinking they've intimidated us. Webb recommended 2 men, former soldiers who'd settled in Montana after the war and were looking for steady employment. They arrived at Iron Hollow a week later, ostensibly hired as ranch hands, but clearly capable of much more. The threats continued, but nothing materialized beyond words. Then, in late summer, Dr. Winslow arrived at the ranch looking grim. The AVMA lawsuit is moving forward, he told Evelyn and Coulter. They've convinced a federal judge that you're operating an unlicensed school and practicing medicine by proxy through your students. The hearing is scheduled for October in Denver. Can we win? Coulter asked. I don't know. The legal precedents are unclear. This is new territory, literally and legally. Winslow paused. But you should know they're bringing serious firepower. 3 lawyers from Chicago, expert witnesses from every major veterinary college, character assassination that'll make Crowley's defense team look gentle. Let me guess, Evelyn said. They're going to paint me as a dangerous charlatan destroying professional standards and endangering public health. That's the general strategy, yes. Evelyn laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. They're really committed to this narrative, aren't they? Woman tries to help people, therefore woman must be destroyed. It's not about you being a woman, Winslow said carefully. It's about you threatening a system that's built on scarcity and credentialism. You've proven that veterinary knowledge doesn't require years of expensive university training to be effective. That's terrifying to people whose authority comes from those credentials. So what do? Coulter asked. We fight. We show that your training program works, that students are successfully treating diseases that licensed veterinarians couldn't cure, that democratizing knowledge helps ranchers instead of harming them. Winslow pulled out a folder. I've been documenting outcomes from your graduates, success rates, cost comparisons, testimonials. We build a case that the traditional system is failing ranchers and your alternative is saving them. They prepared through September, gathering evidence and witness testimony. Evelyn refined her teaching methods, documented every successful treatment performed by her students, compiled data showing that ranchers trained at Iron Hollow had better outcomes than those relying on licensed veterinarians. The numbers were undeniable. Her methods worked. Her students succeeded. The knowledge she was sharing saved livelihoods and lives. But Evelyn had learned by now that being right wasn't enough. 2 weeks before they were scheduled to leave for Denver, a rider arrived at Iron Hollow after dark. He was young, couldn't have been more than 20, and he was bleeding from a gash across his forehead. You Mrs. Hayes? He gasped, sliding off his horse. I am. What happened to you? Men from the AVMA. They came to my ranch, said I was practicing illegal medicine using your treatments. When I told them to leave, He swayed, and Coulter caught him before he fell. They killed my cattle, all of them, said it was a quarantine measure because I couldn't prove I was treating them safely. Evelyn felt ice water flooding her veins. How many cattle? 38 head, everything I owned. The young man's voice broke. They said if I testified for you in Denver, they'd make sure I never worked in livestock again, that every rancher who supported you would get the same treatment. She got him inside, cleaned and bandaged his head wound, gave him food and a place to sleep. Then she and Coulter sat in the kitchen staring at each other while rage and helplessness warred in both their minds. "They're not even pretending to follow the law anymore," Coulter said finally. "They're just destroying anyone who supports you. This is what they do, what they've always done." Evelyn's voice was dead. "My father tried to warn me. He said powerful institutions don't debate ideas, they destroy the people who threaten them. I thought if we were careful, if we built an airtight case, if we showed them we were right." She laughed bitterly. "I was naive. So we're back where we started. Fight and watch good people suffer, or quit and let the bastards win." Evelyn didn't answer. She was thinking about the young rancher sleeping in their spare room, about the 38 cattle killed to make a point, about all the other students from Iron Hollow who were probably receiving similar threats right now. She thought she was building something that could change the system. Instead, she'd just painted targets on everyone who believed in her. "I have to shut it down," she said quietly. "The training program, all of it, before more people get hurt." "Like hell you do." "Coulter." "No." He grabbed her shoulders, forcing her to look at him. "You don't get to quit because things got hard. That young man came here bleeding because he believed in what you taught him. You think he wants you to surrender? You think any of the ranchers you've trained want you to stop fighting? I think they want to keep their livelihoods and not get destroyed for supporting me." "Then give them something worth the risk." Coulter's voice was fierce. "You go to Denver, and you win that case, and you show every rancher in the West that standing up to these people actually means something. Or you quit and prove that power always wins and fighting back just makes things worse. Those aren't the only options." "Yeah, they are. I've been watching you fight this battle for a year now, and I've learned something about how this works. You can't compromise with people who want you destroyed. You can't meet them halfway when they're not willing to move an inch. You either win or you lose, and losing means everyone who trusted you goes down too." Evelyn stared at him, seeing the man who'd been ready to give up his ranch a year ago now telling her she couldn't quit. Seeing the desperate, isolated rancher transformed into someone who believed fighting was worth the cost. "When did you become the optimistic one?" she asked. "About the time you saved my ranch and my life and showed me what stubborn determination looks like." He pulled her into his arms. "We go to Denver. We fight this case. We win or we lose on our own terms, not theirs." Evelyn held on to him, drawing strength from his certainty even as doubt gnawed at her. "And if we lose, then we fought. That's more than most people can say." They left for Denver 3 days later, riding toward a legal battle that would either validate everything they'd built or destroy it completely. The young rancher came with them, determined to testify despite the threats. So did Thomas Webb and a dozen other graduates from Iron Hollow who refused to be intimidated. The case would be decided by people who'd never mixed a chemical compound or treated a dying animal, argued by lawyers who cared more about precedent than practical results. Everything Evelyn had built, the ranch, the training program, her father's legacy, hung in the balance. But as they rode through the early autumn landscape toward an uncertain future, Evelyn realized something had changed. She wasn't fighting alone anymore. She had Coulter, had students who believed in her methods, had evidence that her approach worked better than the established system. Maybe that would be enough. And if it wasn't, well, at least she'd gone down swinging. Denver was bigger and louder than Helena, a city that had grown fat on silver money and railroad connections. The federal courthouse sat in the center of downtown like a monument to authority, all marble columns and brass fixtures designed to remind people that the law was vast and they were small. Evelyn stood on the courthouse steps the morning the trial began, watching well-dressed lawyers file past with leather briefcases and expressions of professional certainty. The AVMA had brought their entire legal arsenal, 5 attorneys, a dozen expert witnesses, and enough documentation to fill 3 wagons. "They're trying to bury us in paperwork," Coulter observed, standing beside her. "They're trying to make this look complicated when it's actually simple." Evelyn adjusted her hat, a practical affair that marked her as exactly what she was, a working rancher's wife, not a society lady playing at science. "Either my methods work or they don't. Either students I've trained are successfully treating cattle or they're not. The rest is just noise." Dr. Winslow joined them, looking nervous. The AVMA brought Dr. Harrison Blackwell as their primary expert witness. He wrote the veterinary licensing standards for 3 states and sits on the accreditation board for every major vet school in the country. So he's the gatekeeper, Evelyn said. He's the wall, and he spent 30 years building that wall specifically to keep people like you out. The courtroom filled quickly. Journalists from newspapers across the West, ranchers who'd traveled to watch the proceedings, representatives from agriculture and livestock associations. Evelyn recognized some of the faces from her training classes, men who'd risked everything to learn methods the establishment claimed were dangerous. The judge was a gray-haired man named Thornton who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. He called the court to order with visible reluctance, clearly aware this case would set precedents neither side would like. The AVMA's lead attorney was a woman named Margaret Sinclair, which surprised Evelyn until Sinclair began speaking. She had the sharp precision of someone who'd fought twice as hard for half the recognition, and she'd apparently decided that destroying other women was how you proved you belonged. Your Honor, Sinclair began, this case concerns the systematic undermining of professional veterinary standards by an unlicensed individual operating under the guise of agricultural education. Mrs. Hayes has trained over 100 people to practice complex medical procedures without oversight, supervision, or any verification of competency. The result has been numerous instances of improper treatment, animal suffering, and public health risks. Evelyn felt Coulter tense beside her, but she put a hand on his arm. Let them make their case. The truth would speak louder than outrage. Sinclair called witness after witness, veterinarians who testified about the dangers of unregulated practice, medical board officials who explained licensing requirements, even a rancher whose cattle had died after he tried to use Evelyn's methods incorrectly. Mr. Peterson, Sinclair said to the rancher, can you describe what happened when you attempted to treat your cattle using Mrs. Hayes's published protocols? Peterson was a heavy man with nervous hands. I mixed the compounds like the manual said, but the cattle got worse instead of better. Lost 6 head before I called a real veterinarian. And what did the licensed veterinarian tell you about the treatment you'd attempted? Said I'd used the wrong concentration, that the manual was too complicated for someone without proper training to follow safely. Sinclair turned to the jury. This is what happens when complex medical knowledge is distributed without proper safeguards. Well-meaning people attempt procedures they don't understand, and animals suffer as a result. Evelyn's attorney, a Denver lawyer named Samuel Chen, who specialized in agricultural law, cross-examined carefully. Mr. Peterson, did you attend any training sessions at Iron Hollow Ranch? No, sir, just read the manual. And the manual specifically states in the introduction that hands-on training is recommended before attempting treatment, correct? Peterson shifted uncomfortably. It might have said something like that. It does say that, in bold text, on the first page. Chen held up a copy. So you ignored the explicit recommendation for training and attempted a complex procedure on your own, and now you're blaming Mrs. Hayes for your decision to disregard her instructions? Objection, Sinclair said. Argumentative. Sustained, Judge Thornton said, but the point had been made. The AVMA's expert witnesses were more difficult to counter. Dr. Blackwell took the stand with the confidence of a man who'd never been seriously challenged, and he systematically dismantled everything Evelyn had built. Veterinary medicine requires years of study, he explained to the jury. Anatomy, physiology, pharmacology, disease pathology. These subjects cannot be adequately taught in a 2-week course at a ranch. Mrs. Hayes may have good intentions, but she's creating a generation of dangerously undertrained practitioners who will cause more harm than good. Dr. Blackwell, Sinclair said, in your professional opinion, are Mrs. Hayes's published treatment protocols safe for use by unlicensed individuals? Absolutely not. The chemical compounds she recommends are highly toxic. The dosing requires precise calculation based on animal weight, infection stage, and individual health factors. Even trained veterinarians sometimes miscalculate. Giving these protocols to ranchers with no medical background is unconscionable. Chen's cross-examination tried to poke holes in Blackwell's testimony, but the man was too experienced, too credentialed, too certain. He had the weight of institutional authority behind every word, and the jury listened like parishioners receiving gospel. Evelyn watched it happen with a sinking feeling. They were losing. Then it was the defense's turn to present their case. Chen called rancher after rancher who'd been trained at Iron Hollow, men who testified about cattle saved, Herds recovered, livelihoods rescued from the edge of ruin. The young man whose cattle had been killed by AVM. Enforcers took the stand and described in detail how Evelyn's methods had worked perfectly until he'd been threatened into stopping. They said I was practicing illegal medicine, he told the jury, his voice shaking with anger. But all I did was save my own animals using knowledge Mrs. Hayes gave me for free. How is that a crime? Dr. Winslow testified about the scientific validity of Evelyn's research, the documented success rates, the careful methodology she'd developed. He brought data showing that ranchers trained at Iron Hollow had better outcomes than those using licensed veterinarians in the same regions. But data and testimonials weren't enough against the weight of institutional disapproval. Finally, Chen called Evelyn to the stand. She walked to the witness box, feeling every eye in the courtroom on her, aware that this moment would determine everything. Not just the case, but whether the year of fighting had meant anything at all. Chen led her through her background, her father's research, the destruction of his reputation, her journey to Montana, and the development of her cure for blood fever. Evelyn spoke clearly, refusing to show the fear gnawing at her insides. Mrs. Hayes, Chen said, why did you publish your treatment manual for free instead of charging for the information? Because knowledge isn't mine to hoard. My father believed that scientific research should serve people, not profit. I was honoring that principle. And the training program at Iron Hollow? What's the purpose of that? To give ranchers tools to save their own animals. Most can't afford licensed veterinarians. Most live too far from cities to get help when they need it. I wanted to make sure distance and poverty didn't mean watching your livelihood die because you couldn't access treatment. Some have argued you're undermining professional standards and creating dangerous practitioners. How do you respond to that? Evelyn turned to face the jury directly. I'm not undermining standards. I'm questioning who gets to set them and why. The current system says only people who can afford expensive university education should have access to medical knowledge. But the ranchers I've trained are just as capable of learning chemistry and biology as any medical student. They just haven't been given the opportunity. I'm giving them that opportunity. Then Sinclair stood for cross-examination, and Evelyn knew the real battle was starting. Mrs. Hayes, you have no formal veterinary credentials, correct? Correct? No medical degree of any kind? None recognized by accredited institutions, no. Yet you claim to be qualified to teach complex medical procedures to others? I claim to have developed effective treatments through rigorous research and testing. Whether institutions recognize that work is irrelevant to whether it functions. Sinclair's eyes narrowed. You're very confident in your abilities. I'm confident in my results. There's a difference. Let's talk about those results. You mentioned that most ranchers can't afford licensed veterinarians. Isn't it true that your free training actually costs students 2 weeks of their time plus travel expenses to reach your ranch? Yes, and that many of your students have reported difficulty successfully applying your methods after returning home? Some students struggle initially, yes. That's why we offer ongoing support and encourage them to return for additional training if needed. So your 2-week course isn't actually sufficient to safely perform these procedures? Evelyn felt the trap closing. Medical education is ongoing. Even licensed veterinarians continue learning throughout their careers. My students are no different. They need practice and experience to become proficient. Yet you send them home after 2 weeks to experiment on animals with toxic chemicals. Sinclair's voice sharpened. Mrs. Hayes, how many cattle have died because your undertrained students made mistakes? I don't have exact numbers. You don't track the failures, only the successes. I track what students report to me. Some failures are inevitable in any medical practice, whether performed by my students or licensed veterinarians. But licensed veterinarians have malpractice insurance, oversight boards, and years of formal education to minimize those failures. Your students have a 2-week course and a manual. Sinclair paused for effect. Isn't the truth that you're more interested in spreading your father's discredited research than in actually helping ranchers? That this whole operation is about vindicating him rather than providing safe, effective treatment? Coulter half rose from his seat, but Evelyn caught his eye and shook her head slightly. She turned back to Sinclair, keeping her voice level despite the rage building in her chest. My father's research was destroyed by people who valued profit over truth. Everything I've done since has been about proving they were wrong, Not for his sake, but because knowledge they tried to bury could save lives if people were allowed to access it. So yes, this is about vindication, but it's also about showing that the system you represent, the one that prioritizes credentials over competence and gatekeeps knowledge to maintain authority, that system fails the people it's supposed to serve. That's a lovely speech, Mrs. Hayes, but it doesn't answer my question about dead cattle. Then let me be clear. Some animals die despite treatment. Students make mistakes. But the ranchers I've trained save far more cattle than they lose, and they do it at a fraction of the cost licensed veterinarians charge. If your system worked, I wouldn't have students lining up for training. The fact that over 100 ranchers have sought me out proves the established veterinary system is failing them. Sinclair smiled coldly. Or it proves that desperate people will grasp at any solution, even dangerous ones, when they're out of options. The cross-examination continued for another hour, Sinclair attacking from every angle, questioning Evelyn's motives, her competence, her results, even her marriage to Coulter. By the time she was dismissed from the stand, Evelyn felt like she'd been in a fist fight. Chen did his best in closing arguments, emphasizing the success stories and the need for accessible veterinary knowledge. But Sinclair's closing was devastating. She painted Evelyn as a delusional woman playing doctor with other people's livelihoods, a dangerous amateur whose arrogance endangered public health. The jury deliberated for 2 days. Evelyn and Coulter spent that time in their hotel room, mostly silent, occasionally talking about what they'd do if they lost, returned to Iron Hollow, and shut down the training program. Maybe Evelyn could still publish research, work quietly on developing new treatments without teaching others. It felt like surrender, but they couldn't keep fighting forever. On the afternoon of the second day, word came that the jury had reached a verdict. The courtroom was packed again, the same faces watching with the same intensity. Evelyn took her seat next to Chen, trying to control her breathing, trying to prepare herself for whatever was coming. Judge Thornton addressed the jury foreman. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor." "On the question of whether the defendant has operated an unlicensed educational institution in violation of territorial medical practice laws, how do you find?" The foreman, a middle-aged rancher from eastern Colorado, looked directly at Evelyn. "We find the defendant not guilty." The courtroom exploded. Cheering from the ranchers in attendance, shouts of outrage from the AVMA representatives, reporters scrambling to get statements. Judge Thornton's gavel cracked repeatedly, fighting for order. Evelyn couldn't breathe, couldn't process what she'd just heard. Not guilty. They'd won. Coulter pulled her into his arms, and she realized she was shaking. Relief and exhaustion, and something like disbelief flooded through her in waves. But Judge Thornton wasn't finished. "However," he said, his voice cutting through the noise, "this court recognizes the concerns raised about public safety and professional standards. Therefore, I am issuing the following order. Mrs. Hayes may continue operating her educational program, but she must implement certification standards for graduates, maintain records of student outcomes, and submit to periodic review by territorial agricultural authorities. Additionally, her published materials must include clear disclaimers about the risks of improper application and the recommendation for hands-on training." It wasn't a complete victory. It was compromised. The court's way of saying Evelyn could continue, but under supervision, regulated, but not shut down. Chen leaned over. "Take it," he whispered. "This is better than we had any right to hope for." Evelyn nodded, not trusting her voice. The trial ended with both sides claiming victory. The AVMA insisted the oversight requirements proved Evelyn's methods needed regulation. Evelyn's supporters celebrated that she'd been allowed to continue teaching at all. But as Evelyn left the courthouse and saw the crowd of ranchers waiting to thank her, to shake her hand, to tell her what her training had meant to their families, she realized something important. She'd changed the conversation. Before Iron Hollow, veterinary knowledge had been locked behind institutional walls, accessible only to those with money and credentials. Now there was an alternative. Imperfect, controversial, but functional. Ranchers had options they'd never had before, and no amount of oversight would put that knowledge back in the bottle. The ride back to Montana took a week. They traveled slowly, stopping at ranches along the way where Evelyn's former students wanted to show her their herds, healthy cattle, recovered from diseases that would have killed them a year ago. Each stop was a reminder that the work had been worth it. that fighting impossible odds sometimes yielded impossible results. "You changed their lives," Coulter said one evening as they camped under stars so bright they hurt to look at. "Not just the cattle, the people. You gave them back their dignity." "I just taught them chemistry and biology." "You taught them they didn't have to accept what powerful people told them was possible." Coulter wrapped his arm around her shoulders. "That's more dangerous than any chemical compound." Iron Hollow Ranch looked different when they returned in late October. Someone had painted the barn. The fences had been repaired. The main house had a new porch that Evelyn didn't remember authorizing. "Students did it," Thomas Webb explained, meeting them in the yard. "Word spread about the trial and folks wanted to show support. Must have been 40 people here over the past month, all volunteering labor and materials. The improvements were touching, but they also represented something larger. A community that had formed around the idea that knowledge should be accessible, that ordinary people could solve extraordinary problems if given the tools and training." Over the winter, Evelyn implemented the court-mandated changes. She developed a certification exam for students, created a tracking system for treatment outcomes, wrote detailed disclaimers for her published materials. The oversight was annoying but manageable, and it gave the program a legitimacy it hadn't had before. Applications for training increased. Ranchers from across the West wanted certification from Iron Hollow, and Evelyn found herself training 2 classes simultaneously, one for cattle diseases, another for sheep and horses. She hired 2 of her best former students as assistant instructors, teaching them how to teach others. Coulter expanded the ranch operation, buying adjacent property that had belonged to one of Crowley's shell companies before the restitution seizures. They ran cattle again, not just training animals, but a real herd, using Evelyn's prevention methods to keep the animals healthy. By spring, they were profitable for the first time in years. Dr. Winslow visited in April with news. "The Journal of Agricultural Science wants to publish your research on parasitic tick control. Full peer-reviewed article, your name as primary author, acknowledgement of your father's foundational work." Evelyn stared at the letter he'd brought. It was everything she'd thought she wanted: academic recognition, vindication, proof that her father's research had been legitimate all along. "What do I have to do?" she asked. "Write it up in proper academic format. Submit it for review. Probably defend it against critics who'll say the same things they said about your father." Winslow paused. "But this time, you'll have documented success from hundreds of treated animals and trained practitioners. You'll have institutional backing from the Department of Agriculture. They can't dismiss you the way they dismissed him." Evelyn thought about it for a long time. The recognition would matter to some people, to former colleagues who doubted her, to the medical establishment that had tried to destroy her, to the memory of her father who died believing his work was worthless. But it didn't matter to the ranchers who came to Iron Hollow for training. It didn't matter to the cattle she saved or the students she taught. The validation she'd been seeking for so long suddenly felt less important than the work she was already doing. "I'll write it," she told Winslow finally, "but not for them. For anyone who comes after me and needs proof that fighting institutional gatekeepers is possible." The article was published in September. It caused exactly the controversy Evelyn expected. Some scientists praising the methodology, others attacking her credentials, most ignoring it entirely because acknowledging her success meant confronting their own failures. Evelyn stopped reading the responses after the first few. She had classes to teach, cattle to treat, students who needed her attention more than academic critics did. One evening in late autumn, almost 2 years after she'd first arrived at Iron Hollow Ranch, Evelyn stood on the porch watching the sun set over the Bitterroot Mountains. The valley that had seemed so hostile and dying when she'd first seen it now looked almost peaceful. Ranches thriving, cattle healthy, people who'd been crushed by Victor Crowley's empire slowly rebuilding their lives. Coulter joined her, handing her a cup of coffee. "Thinking about your father?" he asked. Thinking about what he'd make of all this. The training program, the students, the fact that his research is finally being used the way he intended. She sipped the coffee. "I spent so long trying to vindicate him, to prove the people who destroyed his reputation were wrong. But I'm not sure that was ever really possible." "Why not? You proved his research works, got it published, built a whole program around his methods. But the people who destroyed him, they're still in power, still controlling institutions and gatekeeping knowledge and crushing anyone who threatens their authority. I changed some things on the margins, but the system that killed him is still intact." Coulter was quiet for a moment. Maybe that's not the point. What do you mean? I mean, maybe you can't beat the system entirely. It's too big, too entrenched, got too many people invested in keeping things the way they are. He gestured at the valley. But you can create alternatives. Show people there's another way. Give them options they didn't have before. That doesn't feel like enough, doesn't it? Coulter turned her to face him. 2 years ago, I was dying alone on a ranch everyone thought was cursed, waiting for men like Crowley to take everything I had. Now I'm married to the most brilliant, stubborn woman in Montana, running a teaching operation that's changing how people think about veterinary medicine and actually making a living doing it. You're telling me that's not enough? Evelyn smiled despite herself. When you put it that way, your father's legacy isn't whether some medical journal acknowledges his work. It's this. Coulter gestured at the ranch, the barn converted into classrooms, the bunkhouse full of students. It's knowledge being used instead of locked away. It's people who were powerless getting tools to fight back. That's what he would have wanted, not recognition from people whose opinions he didn't respect anyway. Evelyn leaned against him, watching darkness settle over the valley. How did you get so wise? I married a woman who taught me that losing is only permanent if you stop fighting. Everything else I learned from you. They stood there as stars appeared overhead, two people who'd found each other by accident and built something neither had planned for. The ranch would never be perfect. The fight against institutional gatekeeping would never be fully won. There would always be another Victor Crowley, another medical board, another lawsuit trying to shut them down. But they'd proven something important. That ordinary people with knowledge and determination could challenge systems designed to keep them powerless. That credentials weren't the same as competence. That the establishment's authority came from controlling information, and once that information was free, their power diminished. Over the next year, Iron Hollow continued growing. Evelyn trained over 300 students. Her published research was cited in agricultural journals and veterinary textbooks, usually with disclaimers about unconventional methods, but acknowledged nonetheless. The Montana territorial government officially recognized her certification program, making graduates eligible for agricultural employment that had previously required veterinary licenses. Other women started showing up, daughters of ranchers, widows who'd inherited farms, even a few who'd been rejected from medical schools and were looking for alternative paths to scientific work. Evelyn taught them all, remembering what it felt like to have knowledge but no legitimate way to use it. Some of those women went on to establish their own training programs in other territories, spreading the model Iron Hollow had developed. The AVMA tried to shut them down individually, but there were too many now, too dispersed, too supported by local communities who'd seen the results. The gatekeepers were losing control of the gate. In the spring of their third year at Iron Hollow, Evelyn discovered she was pregnant. The news hit her like a physical blow, not unwelcome, but terrifying in ways she hadn't anticipated. She'd spent so long focused on work and fighting and building something lasting that she hadn't thought about what it would mean to bring a child into this life she'd created. "What if I'm terrible at it?" she asked Coulter that night. "I don't know how to be a mother. My own mother died when I was young. I've spent my entire life focused on science and research, not raising children." "You'll figure it out the same way you figured out everything else," Coulter said, by being stubborn and brilliant and refusing to accept that you can't do something just because it's difficult. That's not how parenting works. Maybe not, but I'd rather have a child raised by someone who fights for what they believe in than someone who always takes the safe path. He put his hand on her stomach. This kid's going to grow up watching you teach people that knowledge is power, watching you challenge systems that tell women they can't be scientists. That's a better education than any school could provide. The baby was born in January during a blizzard that shut down the valley for 3 days. Evelyn labored for 12 hours in the ranch house while Coulter held her hand, and Thomas Webb's wife, a midwife who'd moved to Montana the previous summer, provided guidance that kept both mother and child alive. They named her Rachel, after Evelyn's mother. Holding her daughter for the first time, Evelyn thought about all the fighting she'd done, all the institutions she'd challenged, all the powerful people who'd tried to stop her. And she realized that the most revolutionary thing she could do now was raise a child who understood that the world's limitations were often just other people's fears pretending to be facts. Rachel grew up in this barn-turned classroom, sleeping in a basket while Evelyn taught chemistry to ranchers, learning her letters from veterinary manuals, understanding from her earliest memories that knowledge was something to be shared rather than hoarded. By the time she was 5, she could identify parasitic infections by sight and recite chemical formulas that most adults couldn't understand. Evelyn and Coulter had 2 more children over the next 6 years, a son named Jonathan after Evelyn's father, and another daughter they called Margaret, who had her mother's sharp mind and her father's quiet determination. The ranch expanded to accommodate the growing family and the growing training program. Students came from as far as California and Texas, some staying for weeks to complete advanced courses Evelyn had developed. The original 2-week program had evolved into a comprehensive curriculum covering everything from basic animal husbandry to complex surgical procedures. Some of Evelyn's students went on to establish veterinary practices of their own, using methods they'd learned at Iron Hollow to provide affordable care in rural communities that had never had access to professional treatment before. Others became agricultural inspectors, using their training to identify disease outbreaks early and prevent the kind of catastrophic losses that had nearly destroyed Coulter's ranch. The knowledge that had once been locked behind institutional walls was now widespread, accessible, and constantly evolving as practitioners shared improvements and innovations. Victor Crowley died in federal prison in his 6th year of incarceration, his empire dissolved, his name synonymous with corruption. His death barely made the newspapers. The man who'd once controlled half of Montana territory had been so thoroughly erased that most people under 30 had never heard of him. Meanwhile, Evelyn's training manual was in its 8th edition, with translations being prepared for Spanish-speaking ranchers in the Southwest. The woman who'd arrived in Montana as a desperate mail-order bride with secrets and a dying rancher's address had become one of the most influential figures in Western agricultural development. But when journalists came to interview her about her accomplishments, Evelyn always deflected attention back to the work. "I didn't do anything special," she told a reporter from the San Francisco Chronicle when Rachel was 10. "I just refused to accept that knowledge should belong to institutions instead of people who need it. Anyone could have done the same thing if they'd been willing to fight for it." "But most people aren't willing to fight institutional power the way you did," the reporter pressed. "What made you different?" Evelyn thought about her father dying with his reputation destroyed, about arriving at Iron Hollow Ranch with nothing but determination and dangerous ideas, about standing in courtrooms and facing down lawyers who wanted to silence her. "I didn't have anything left to lose," she said finally. "When you've already lost everything that matters, fighting becomes easier. You stop caring about consequences because the worst thing that could happen already happened." "And now that you've built all this, the ranch, the training program, your family, don't you have things to lose again?" "Of course. But I also know that the things worth having are the things you're willing to fight for. I fought for this life. If someone tries to take it, I'll fight to keep it. That's not bravery. It's just understanding that nothing valuable comes without cost." The interview ran on the front page with a photograph of Evelyn in her laboratory, surrounded by beakers and Bunsen burners and the tools of scientific inquiry. She looked tired and determined and completely at home in a space most people still thought women didn't belong. Letters arrived from all over the country. Women thanking her for proving they could be scientists, young people asking how to pursue unconventional education paths, even some from academic institutions inviting her to lecture or accept honorary degrees. Evelyn declined most of them. She had students to teach, children to raise, research to conduct. The recognition was nice, but it wasn't why she did the work. On her 40th birthday, Coulter surprised her with a party. Every student she'd ever trained who could make the journey came to Iron Hollow. Over 200 people crowding into the barn and spilling out into the yard, sharing stories about cattle saved and livelihoods rescued and lives changed by knowledge Evelyn had given them freely. Thomas Webb gave a toast. "To the woman who taught us that the only thing more dangerous than ignorance is people who profit from keeping others ignorant. And to the stubborn bastard who married her and showed us what partnership looks like when both people are too ornery to quit." Everyone laughed and drank, and Evelyn felt something she hadn't let herself feel in a long time. Pride. Not in defeating enemies or winning battles, but in building something that would outlast her, in creating a model other people could replicate, in proving that alternatives to established systems were possible if someone was brave enough or desperate enough to create them. Late that night, after the guests had departed and the children were asleep, Evelyn and Coulter sat on the porch watching stars wheel overhead. "You think you did enough?" Coulter asked. Vindicated your father, changed the system, all the things you came here to do? Evelyn considered this question. I don't think the system changes. Not really. There will always be gatekeepers trying to control knowledge, institutions protecting their authority, powerful people crushing anyone who threatens them. So nothing changed? I didn't say that, Evelyn smiled. I said the system doesn't change, but people do. And when enough people change, when enough of them realize they don't have to accept the limitations others impose on them, the system starts to matter less. You can't destroy it. You can make it irrelevant by building better alternatives. That's a long way from the angry woman who showed up here planning to use my dying ranch to prove a point. That woman was terrified and desperate, and so focused on revenge she couldn't see past it. Evelyn leaned against him. I'm still angry, still fighting, but now I understand that the fight isn't about destroying enemies. It's about building things they can't touch, creating knowledge they can't lock away, teaching people they can't silence. And you're happy with that? I'm satisfied with it, which is probably better than happiness anyway. They sat in comfortable silence, two people who'd built a life from desperation and stubbornness, and the refusal to accept that powerful people always won. The ranch stretched out around them, barn lights glowing, cattle sleeping peacefully in their pastures. Students' names carved into the bunkhouse wall marking everyone who'd passed through and carried Evelyn's teachings out into the world. Iron Hollow Ranch had been dying when Evelyn first saw it, cursed by bad luck and powerful enemies, and a valley that had given up hope. Now it was the center of a quiet revolution in agricultural education, proof that alternatives to established systems could flourish if someone was willing to fight hard enough to create space for them. And the woman who'd arrived as a fraud and a liar had become exactly what she'd been pretending to be. A scientist, a teacher, a person who'd changed the world not by defeating it, but by refusing to let it define what was possible. Years later, when Evelyn was old and her children were running the training program themselves, a young woman arrived at Iron Hollow with a familiar story. She'd been rejected from medical schools because of her gender, told her research was worthless because she lacked credentials, driven out of her home state by men who saw her intelligence as a threat. I don't know what to do, the young woman said, sitting in Evelyn's kitchen. I have knowledge that could help people, but no one will listen to me. The system won't let me in. Evelyn, gray-haired now but with eyes just as sharp, smiled. Then stop trying to get in, she said. Build something outside the system. Create alternatives they can't control. Make yourself too useful to ignore and too widespread to shut down. How? The same way anyone does anything worth doing, by being willing to fight, by accepting that you'll fail sometimes and get back up anyway, by understanding that the institutions protecting their power aren't actually that strong. They just want you to think they are. Evelyn poured coffee for both of them. The world tells women like us that we can't do things. Our job is to prove them wrong so thoroughly they can't deny it anymore. The young woman left Iron Hollow 2 weeks later with training and techniques no university taught, and knowledge the medical establishment tried to suppress. She went on to establish her own program in Oregon, then another in Nevada, spreading the model Evelyn had developed. The revolution continued. And in the Bitterroot Valley of Montana, on a ranch that had once been dying but was now thriving, an old woman taught chemistry to ranchers and raised grandchildren who understood that the only real limitations were the ones you accepted. The story of Iron Hollow Ranch became legend in agricultural circles. The mail-order bride who'd saved a dying ranch and changed veterinary medicine. The rancher who'd fought beside her. The empire of knowledge they'd built from nothing but determination and dangerous ideas. But to Evelyn, it was simpler than that. She'd arrived in Montana with nothing left to lose and everything to prove. She'd fought institutions designed to crush her, survived attempts to silence her, and built something that would outlast everyone who'd tried to stop her. She'd won not by defeating her enemies, but by making them irrelevant. And in the end, that was the only victory that mattered, proving that the world's limitations were just other people's fears, and that anyone brave enough or desperate enough could build alternatives that rendered those limitations meaningless. The ranch still stood, the students still came, the knowledge still spread. And somewhere in Montana, under stars that had watched the whole story unfold, the legacy of one woman's refusal to accept defeat continued changing lives. That was enough.